A young man named Fujisaki Yuto was standing on the street, surrounded by warmly dressed people. Yuto was 20 years old. He's been trying to enter an educational institution for 2 years. Yuto's face was gloomy, and a scarf was tied around his neck. Yuto found himself alone. He held his head and thought that he had failed to enroll this time. Yuto found himself in front of the glass doors. There is a cheerful sign with a logo above the door. Yuto went into the store. He continued to hold his head. Then he adjusted his glasses and thought that most likely he just didn't try hard enough. Next year he must pass everything. Yuto raises his head and sees an armed man standing at the cash register and threatening the girl to the seller. It was a robber. Drops of sweat appeared on Yuto's face. He thought in fright that this man was really a robber. A man with a medical mask on his face shouted that the cashier should give him the money. Yuto continued to observe everything from the side. A man with a knife in his hands began to shout angrily that why the girl froze and did not see him. The girl was putting the squeeze on her face. Tears appeared on her face. The man was holding a knife in his hands and glaring viciously ahead. Yuto armed himself with a mop and struck at the thief. The thief dropped his knife from his hands in pain, and tears sprang from his eyes. The thief took his hand in pain. Without thinking, the cashier girl took a large spoon from the display case and threw it in front of her. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming from them. The big spoon that the girl threw hits the thief right in the face. The next moment, Yuto strikes the thief's back with another blow. The thief's eyes start rolling in pain. The thief fell to the floor, his knife lying next to him. Yuto and the girl stood motionless. A broken mop also lay next to the thief on the floor. Yuto was covered in sweat. He was trying to catch his breath. Then he looked at the girl who was standing behind the counter without moving. After a while, the girl smiled. Sweat was running down her face and said that she thanked Yuto for his help. The brightest light appeared in Yuto's eyes. Then the cashier girl began to dissipate. Gradually, everything began to darken in Yuto's eyes. Yuto abruptly opened his eyes. There was no one around him. Yuto looked at the sky and thought that he did not understand where he was. Maybe it was paradise. Yuto was in a small area that was floating in the air and was lined up in a cage. There was a man standing behind Yuto. Yuto turned around sharply. There was a bald man standing behind Yuto. The man smiled at first and then started shouting that Yuto had finally come, but first he would like to apologize. Yuto nervously adjusted his glasses and replied to the man that he did not quite understand what was happening now, why the man was apologizing. The man stood in front of Yuto, slightly hunched over. The man closed his eyes and lowered his head. Then he said that he had cast a spell on all three of them. It was equivalent to death. Yuto looked at the man in surprise. His hands were lowered to the bottom. Yuto doubtfully tried to say who this man is. The man raised his head and began to say that he was the one who was called a demigod. They were in a border world, one step away from paradise. His plan could not be implemented. There were several more islands floating in the air. The man continued to walk with his leggings, and Yuto watched him closely. The man walked away from Yuto. He exhaled heavily and said that he was really sorry that it had happened. Yuto started shouting that he was wondering what would happen to him now. The man frowned at Yuto over his shoulder. The man looked at Yuto and replied with a smile that he would direct his power to Yuto's rebirth. There were many wrinkles on the man's face. The man looked at Yuto and continued to say that, however, he would not be able to return Yuto to his world. Yuto would end up in a world controlled by a man. The man's abilities, unfortunately, are limited. Yuto listened to the man in fright. Yuto asked about the world he would enter in the future. The man spread his arms to the side, and behind him were a witch, an archer, and other people. Maju Chin said that Yuto would enter the world of fantasy, the world of swords and magic. Yuto imagined frightening monsters when a strange man said that there are many magical creatures and dangerous places in that world now. The unknown man turned to Yuto and seemed that, although he could not help much, he could give Yuto special skills. The man's clothes were developing from the tailwind. The man turned to Yuto. Yuto clenched his hands into fists and said he had a few questions. Could he ask them? The man answered Yuto's question positively. The man and Yuto began to discuss who Yuto should be reborn into. Yuto will be an ordinary person who can use magic, but not all of its types. The man thoughtfully touched his chin, and Yuto looked at him in fright. The man held up his finger, and several symbols appeared next to him. The man with a smile on his face began to say that there are 4 basic elements: fire, water, wind, earth, as well as combined magic. The man abruptly pointed his finger at Yuto and said that he could reveal his status. Yuto raised his hand and looked at the man in fright. Yuto lowered his hands to the bottom and repeated the man's words about the status. After a while, a table opens in front of Yuto. Yuto did not come to life and was very scared. A table with characteristics opened in front of Yuto. Almost all of them were equal to 0. The man said that this way Yuto would be able to learn more about his abilities. The man stood behind Yuto. He scratched his chin enticingly and said that Yuto had a rank, and he hadn't even given Yuto anything yet. Yuto looked at the man standing next to him in surprise. The man held out his hand to Yuto and said that they had little time left. What kind of ability did Yuto want to get for himself? Yuto looked at the man thoughtfully. Yuto clenched one hand into a fist. He put the other on his chest and shouted that he wanted a talent with which the reward would match his efforts. There was a sky around Yuto with clouds floating on it. The man frowned and looked at Yuto in surprise. Then the man said that this skill would not be too simple. Yuto stood in front of the man without moving. Yuto was standing in the same position. He started shouting that this skill might be simple, but with Yuto's luck, even if the level rises, there is a chance that the characteristics will not increase at all. Yuto stood in front of the man. He lowered his hands to the bottom. The man touched his chin and looked away. Then the man lifted the kid up and said that he understood everything. In that case, he would give Yuto the skill of innate talent. Yuto and the man presented 2 people with the same number of levels. The man went on to say that this ability would increase the experience points needed to gain a level. It would be 3 times faster than usual. Then the guys introduced 2 more people. The man continued to talk about the features of Yuto's ability. As the level increases, each ability increases by 1 point, which does not happen for an ordinary person. Yuto's face turned red, and he started shouting that he could really climb faster than other people. If that was the case, then he was asking to be given this ability. Yuto's eyes began to shine unusually. The man's pupil changed, and an unusual symbol began to be reflected in it. The man said that in the same way, the man gives Yuto the ability of clairvoyance. It allows you to evaluate other people and objects, feel magic, and so on. Yuto calmed down. He looked at the man and said that, speaking of a demigod, what would happen to this man now? There was a sky with light clouds around Yuto. The man stood in front of Yuto and replied that he had decided to reborn Yuto. In that case, his existence was coming to an end. Yuto calmly listened to the man who said that his doppelgangers would take care of the other 2 people, but they were only doppelgangers, so they had half the power. The man put his hands on Yuto's shoulders and continued to say that the other 2 people would only receive a small amount of strength. The man held his hands on Yuto's shoulders and said with a smile that he trusted his doppelgangers, and their time was running out. Bright light began to appear around. Yuto did not take his eyes off the man. There was a light on in one of the houses, on the 2nd floor. The man was holding a bewitched child in his arms who was crying loudly. A table appeared next to the child. It was a reborn Yuto. In this world, his name was Mars Bryant. Mars was sitting in a sharp cot with almost no hair on his head. Then he began to crawl, and blonde hair appeared on his head. And after a while, Mars matured and started walking. After a while, Mars developed the ability of clairvoyance. Mars walked with a smile on his face and explored the world, while he raised his mana points from 0 to the maximum. Mars studied flowers, trees, household items which had the status of good. The blonde Mars was running around a wooden table where 2 adults and a child were sitting. There were cutlery and a breadbasket on the table. There was also a large stone stove with jugs in the room. The man held bread in his hands and said with a smile that Mars was very accommodating. Mars activated the ability of clairvoyance. The man's name was Zeke Bryant. He wielded a sword and earth magic, and he also possessed high skills. The woman was also laughing bread in her hands and replied with a smile that communication with Ike had a positive effect on him. The girl's name was Maria Bryant. She wielded a sword and water magic. The dark-haired boy was eating bread and replied that Mars was really amazing. The boy's name was I.E. Bryant, and he wielded a sword, a spear, and fire magic. There was a plate of food and a wooden cup in front of Ike. The blonde Mars was sitting on a child's chair. One of his parents gave him a ball of food. Mars clenched his hands into a fist and smiled. A table with characteristics appeared next to it. Mars was in bed. His head was on the pillow, and he was sleeping with his mouth open. Mars thought that he had used up all his available mana, so he was tired and needed to sleep. Mars continued to lie on the bed, but he was no longer asleep, but was running his finger over the table with characteristics. Mars thought that after sleeping, his magic power had increased again. The table of characteristics disappeared. Mars raised his hand up and began to examine it. Then he thought that it seemed to him that soon he would be able to try to use magic. Wooden floors and the roof of the house were located above Mars. Mars continued to hold his hand in the air. Then he smiled and sharply shouted the word thunder. Mars's voice and eyes were full of confidence. After that, nothing happened. Mars continued to hold his hand in the air. Then he began to smile and think that he knew it until he could not use magic. Mars continued to lie on the bed. He put his arms and legs together, then closed his eyes, and thought that he needed to learn how to use magic as soon as possible. Mars, his parents, and his brother were sitting at a table by candlelight. Everyone except Mars started eating food. After thinking a little, Mars smiled and called his parents. There were plates and mugs on the table, as well as a breadbasket. The parents looked at Mars in fright when he said that they could explain how to use magic. Mars's brother looked at him and continued to chew on a bread roll. Maria leaned towards Mars. She smiled nervously and began to say that why was Yuto asking such questions? Mars happily replied that if he had talent, he wanted to try and learn it as soon as possible. Maria continued to smile nervously. Mars's face turned red. He looked at Maria with a smile and said that she could teach him healing magic. Yuta's blonde hair was sticking out in different directions. Maria put her hand to her face. She smiled nervously and replied that she did not understand why Mars needed healing magic. Maria's hair was neatly styled and a dark ribbon was tied around her neck. Mars's parents opened their mouths in surprise and stood up from their chairs when Mars said that he dreamed of healing the wounds of Mom and Dad. Maria shook her head and whispered to Zeke that they needed to check if Mars could use his magic. It was better to determine his magical abilities in advance. The adults looked away during the conversation. Zeke put his hands together and looked down. Then Maria said that she and Zeke needed to discuss something important, so the guys needed to go to bed. The children listened attentively to their parents and obeyed their words. Ike and Mars were outside. Mars ate his parents with a smile on his face. Zeke said that in connection with yesterday's conversation, he and his mother decided to teach the children magic. Zeke stood in front of the guys. He kept his hands on his belt and said that Mars had to make a promise first. Maria stood behind Zeke and smiled. The children stood in front of their parents. Zeke continued to say that sacred magic is a rare and valuable kind of magic. It can be used to heal wounds and diseases. The family was standing not far from the house, next to a stone wall. Zeke leaned towards Mars. His face was gloomy, and he said that if Mars still has this magic, then he and his mother think it's better not to tell anyone about it. Mars began to sweat from fright. Zeke put his hands on Mars's shoulders and asked with a grim smile if Mars had understood everything correctly. After a while, Mars began to smile broadly. His face turned red, and he answered his father's question positively. Clouds were floating in the sky. The guys sat down on the ground and closed their eyes. Zeke started saying that the guys should focus their attention below the navel. That's where the magic power accumulates, and that's how they learn from the guys a penchant for certain magic. The guys continued to sit on the ground, their faces becoming more and more tense. Zeke went on to say that the guys should imagine how this energy circulates inside them. Then they will understand if they have a talent for magic. Magical energy began to condense in the abdominal area of one of the guys. Waves radiated from it throughout the body. Mars thought that he could feel the energy in his body. Now he needed to get it to circulate throughout his body. Mars squeezed his eyes shut and clenched his lips. Beads of sweat appeared on his face. He persistently thought that it was necessary to make magical energy move through his body, just as blood does. Magical energy began to appear around the guys. The parents were surprised to say that the guys both coped. Now they need to find out what type of magic each has, determine it with the help of a crystal. Aika will start first. Aika blushed and was holy with happiness. His stats were revealed. He wielded a sword, a spear, and fire magic. The parents were surprised by such results of their son and said that he was a gifted child and would become a knight. Then the characteristics of Mars were revealed. He was smiling and scratching his head nervously. The parents nervously said that Mars's mana level is almost 5 times higher than his and Maria's. Mars is really a real genius. The next day came. A bright sky stretched over the house of the Mars family. Zeke took out 2 books and said that he had bought a grimoire. Mars was sitting on Maria's lap and reading a book with a picture of a tornado, and Ike was sitting on Zeke's lap and reading a book. Then the guys found themselves on the street. Mars stood in front of the family and began to conjure. Mars closed his eyes and put his hand forward. He thought that he needed to direct the magic power to his fingers, and then he needed to pronounce the word wind. Mars opens his eyes and confidently calls the wind. The next moment, a stream of wind appears from Mars's hand. His parents and brother looked at Mars in surprise. Leaves and pieces of earth rose into the air. Maria hugged Mars tightly. Other family members joined her and began to hug Mars too, and at the same time praise his abilities. Gradually, it began to get dark. Mars's parents and brother continued to praise him. A few more days passed and Ike was also able to use fire magic. Marie started hugging Ike. A fire was burning in his hand. Zeke and Mars were standing next to each other and smiling. A whole year has passed. The guys were standing on the edge of the forest, not far from the house. Their eyes were closed and there was silence around. There were trees next to the house, mountains, and a sky with clouds of dust were visible behind the house. Mars and Ike stood in place, their eyes closed and their faces relaxed. The guys opened their mouths and breathed for concentration. Mars put his hands in front of him and began to conjure. Then he had a weapon in his hands, and Mars began to make attacks. In turn, Ike took his hand aside and began to conjure. Then he put his hand in front of him and a column of fire appeared from it. Sweat was running down the guys' faces. Mars held his hand in front of him and Ike held a stick. Tables with characteristics appeared in front of the guys. The children looked in front of them and saw their parents at the stone wall. Marie started waving to the guys and said they were back. At the same time, the guys started running to meet their parents. The children shouted joyfully that they were glad to see their parents back. Zeke held a stick in one hand and a bag in the other. Maria held her hands out in front of her, and a bag was also hanging on her. Zeke said with a smile on his face that he had brought something interesting for the guys. He would show it to the guys a little later. Maria was standing next to her and covered the smile on her face with her hand. The guys reacted positively to Zeke's suggestion. It began to get dark. The whole family was in the house. The children and their parents were sitting at a wooden table. There was a bag on the table in front of Zeke. Zeke took out a sword from his bag, which was engraved with an unusual ornament. Zeke was wearing gloves on his hands. He said that's what he wanted to show. Mars activated his ability and characteristics appeared next to the sword. It was the sword of the spirit of fire. Mars thought that if you just hold this sword in your hands, it will increase your magic power. After a while, Zeke handed the sword to Ike and said that he was giving the sword to Ike. Ike took the sword in his hands, his face turned red, and he began to thank his father for the gift. Then Zeke started to reach into his bag. He pulled out a book and handed it to Mars. At the same time, Zeke said that Mars should carefully study this book. Mars shouted that it was really a grimoire of sacred magic for beginners. Mars took the book in his hands. Then he clenched his hand into a fist and, with a smile on his face, loudly thanked his father for the gift. Evening came. It was quiet outside. Only Mars could be heard, who was trying to activate the healing ability. Mars held his hand out in front of him and thought that yesterday he had failed to use the healing ability. Ike was practicing with a sword near Mars. Mars closed his eyes and continued to hold his hand in front of him. Mars continued to cast a healing spell and think that if he wanted, he would definitely succeed. Mars furrowed his brows and a magical aura began to appear around him. Mars continued to cast the healing spell. Then a clot of magic began to appear in Mars's hand and he managed to activate a healing spell. Mars turned to his brother and started shouting with a smile on his face that he had finally managed to apply a healing spell. Ike looked at his brother in surprise. Mars came up to his brother and told him why he wasn't using the salamander sword. Ike looked at Mars in surprise. He also held his sword on his shoulder. Ike's face was covered in sweat from training. He looked at his brother with a smile and said that his father told him to learn the basics first, which is why Ike uses another sword. Mars looked at his brother with a smile on his face and replied that he understood everything. Their father was really very serious. Ike was holding a sword on his shoulder and laughing loudly. The guys turned to the side as they heard someone calling their name. Then the guys' faces changed a lot. They opened their mouths and eyes wide in fright. The children were called by their parents. They were walking towards the house. The parents of the children were all bruised. Maria held Zeke's hand and helped him walk. The children ran scared to their injured parents while they shouted that Mom and Dad were definitely all right. The parents stopped at a stone fence on the path that led to their house. The parents, with a smile on their face, started saying that the monster in the dungeon had attacked them. Could the guys bring them towels? Mars asked his parents to stop. Mars examined his parents and realized that his father's wounds were much more serious than his mother's. Mars put his hands in front of him and began to look focused. Zeke looked at him in surprise and said he didn't understand what Mars wanted to do. Mars continued to hold his hands in front of him and activate the healing spell. A bright glow began to appear in front of Zeke's face, and his wounds began to heal gradually. Mars began to wipe his face with his hand. He was covered in sweat. Maria stood in front of her son and looked at him in surprise. Mars began to heal her as well. Maria and Zeke opened their mouths in surprise. They touched their bodies and began to worship. With the help of the healing magic of Mars, the wounds of the parents disappeared. Mars stood in front of his parents. He smiled broadly with his eyes closed and said that he had managed to heal all the wounds. Maria and Zeke put their hands to their faces. Zeke dropped his staff and replied that thanks to Mars, everything was fine with them now. The children stood in front of their parents and were silent. Maria approached Mars and hugged him tightly. She closed her eyes and shouted joyfully that she was grateful to Mars. Had he already learned the magic of healing? Mars blushed and began hugging Maria with a smile on his face. Maria and Mars hugged each other for a while and smiled happily. Ike was standing next to them, laughing loudly. Zeke stood on the sidelines and watched what was happening, not showing his emotions. Evening came. The fire in the fireplace began to burn. The whole family found themselves at a wooden table. In front of each family member was a mug with a warm drink. Zeke said they could start a family meeting now to discuss the future. Zeke was serious. He looked at the guys and said it was time to discuss their work with his mother. They are adventurers and explore dungeons and exterminate monsters around him. Zeke took a mug with a drink in his hand and continued to say that some time ago, one count who rules this land ordered him to deal with a monster in one dungeon. The children sat opposite their parents and listened attentively to their father's story. Zeke put the mug on the table and said that today he and his mother went to the dungeon, and today they found out that Mars can use sacred power and came up with something. The boys put their hands on the table and listened attentively to their father. Zeke held up his finger and said that if they wanted, the guys could help him and Mom with work, but it would be in 1 year. Zeke intends to make a decision himself after his sons grow up. Bright flames were burning in the fireplace. The boys looked at their father with a smile and agreed with him. Zeke interrupted the guys and said that he would have another piece of news for the guys. Zeke put his hands together on the table. He smiled broadly and said that soon the guys would have a younger brother or sister. Maria blushed. She put her hand on Zeke's arm and began to smile broadly. It was completely dark outside the window. Mars grabbed the table. His face was red. He was very surprised to hear this news from his father. Ike was sitting next to him. He clenched his hands into fists and began to smile broadly with joy. Another year has passed. A lush tree grew next to the house of Mars and his family, and fluffy clouds floated across the sky. The guys were outside, holding swords in their hands and preparing to attack each other. After a while, the guys rushed to each other. Mars, with the help of its ability to control the wind, betrayed acceleration. The guys approached each other and began to masterfully strike at each other. Mars was determined. He struck with his sword at Ike. Ike, in turn, struck at his brother. After a while, the swords of the brothers joined. The guys were determined. They looked at each other with smiles on their faces. Unusual clusters of energy formed around the guys. Mars and Ike continued to fight with smiles on their faces. Mars thought that a lot had happened in the past year. The statuses of the guys increased slightly, but the possession of special skills showed a low level of abilities. Ike held a fire sword in his hands and practiced with it. His parents and Mars stood behind him and admired his abilities. Then the door opened, and Mars thought that Ike had started practicing with a magic sword. But a more important event was happening. This important event was the birth of Mars and Ike's sister. Mars activated his ability and saw that the girl's name was Lena. She had water magic and earth magic. The girl was lying in a crib under a blanket and smiling broadly. The whole family was standing around the crib where Lena was lying. They looked at the girl with smiles on their faces and affection. Lena began to reach out to her relatives, and they, in turn, thought that the girl was very cute. After a while, the whole family found themselves at the dinner table. The fire in the fireplace was not lit. There was a glass of drink on the tables in front of each family member. Zeke started saying that a year had passed, and the guys were much stronger than Zeke expected. Zeke leaned a little on the table and continued to say that starting tomorrow they would all go exploring together. Ike supported his father's words. Maria frowned and began to say that she couldn't get rid of her anxious thoughts. The guys looked at their mother in fright. She continued to say that if the guys took Mars with them to heal their wounds, even if the battle would be calm, if he was around. Then Maria got up from her chair and leaned on the table. Maria began to shout loudly that Mars was only 3 years old. She was very worried about it. Maria stood on the floor and leaned on the table. She continued to shout that Mars might be a gifted child, but it was too early for him to participate in such battles. Zeke put his hands on the table and listened attentively to his wife. The boys listened to their mother in silence. Marie sat down on the chair again. She picked up the mug and looked at it. After thinking a little, Maria said that it was too early for Ike to participate in battles too. She would like to go herself, but it was tedious to look after Lena. After thinking for a while, Marie looked at Mars and said what he thought about it. Zeke and Ike stared at Maria and Mars. There was a large window behind Zeke, through which one could see lush trees and a cloudy sky. Mars looked at Zeke and said he wanted to go with his dad and Ike, but he also understood what Mom was talking about. Maria held a mug in her hands and looked piteously at her youngest son. Then she closed her eyes and said that she understood everything. Mars's face broke into a smile when he heard his mother's words, that it was better for the three of them to stay together. They should not separate from each other, and they also need to avoid areas saturated with magic. Ike smiled and looked at his mother. Maria held up her finger and, with a serious expression on her face, said that since the guys were still children, they would not be able to use the equipment, but at the same time, they should be ready for any events and consequences. There was a cupboard with dishes in the room. Maria continued to warn the children about the dangers and what they should take with them. Zeke looked at his wife in surprise when she started talking about him. Zeke smiled and said that Maria should rely on him. Clouds floated across the sky that stretched over the house of Mars and his family. The guys found themselves on the street, not far from the house. Maria saw them off and wished them good luck. Zeke was holding his staff and bag, Ike was holding a sword on his back, and Mars was saying goodbye to his mother. The guys found themselves next to the guild building. Mars and Ike stood outside and thoughtfully looked at the surroundings. There were a lot of people near the guild building, and on the building itself there was an inscription and the coats of arms of the guild. Mars was looking at a man and a woman who were laughing and chatting. Mars thought it was the first time he had seen other children besides themselves. Then Mars's pupils changed. He activated his clairvoyance ability. The young man raised his hand and told the girl something with a smile on his face. She laughed in response. Next to the guys, there were tables with their characteristics. Mars looked at them and wondered if he and his brother were really that strong. Zeke came up to the guys. He smiled and said that he was sorry for the delay. He took the task of hunting monsters. There were multi-story buildings in the city. The guys were walking down the street after Zeke. There were a lot of people in different outfits around them. A tree with a lush crown was stirred by the wind, and some leaves fell to the ground. The guys found themselves at a long wall. The entrance was guarded by 2 knights. Zeke looked at the guys, and with a smile on his face, he said that they needed to go through the gate. The gate opened, and the guys joyfully ran forward. Zeke walked through the gate slowly and carefully watched his children. The guys stopped on the road, and Ike had a sword hanging on his back. Zeke approached the guys. The wind lifted dust and tree leaves into the air. Mars's face began to glow with joy. He looked in front of him and smiled broadly. The guys and Zeke had a view of the hilly territory through which the road passed. It led to the forest and high mountains. The wind blew along the way and carried the leaves of the trees and dust. Zeke put his hand on his belt, and in the other he held his staff. Zeke smiled and said that he didn't expect them to get to this place so quickly. Mars looked in surprise into the bushes, from which a frightening noise began to be heard. The bushes were not far from the place where the guys were standing. Mars activated his ability and began to bring his gaze closer to the place where the noise was coming from. Mars was very surprised because he saw several monsters hiding in the bushes and laughing. Several monsters were standing in the bushes. They were wearing some kind of rags. The monsters were looking at each other and laughing. Mars thought, startled, that these were goblins. They had low characteristics. The monsters looked at the guys in fright as Zeke made a strange sound. Then the goblins rushed towards the guys. They were full of anger. Zeke said he was going to show me how to deal with monsters, and Ike should do the same. The monsters were running towards the guys. Zeke looked at his sons and said that Ike should be able to deal with the monster with fire, but the sword should always be ready. Zeke held his hand out in front of him and began to conjure. Then Zeke took a staff in his hand and held it in front of him. He cast a spell, and stones flew at the monsters. A few stones hit the monsters, and a few flew past. 2 monsters fell. One remained unharmed. Zeke crouched behind Ike and said that he needed to attack the monster. Ike put his hands in front of him and began to conjure. The monster began to grin and release its claws to attack. Ike's gaze was serious. The monster appeared a few meters away from Ike. Ike held his hands in front of him, and as soon as the monster got close to Ike, he launched a fire attack. There was a loud sound, and the monster was blinded by a bright flash. The monster collapsed to the ground. It was engulfed in fire. The monster began to scream and beat his hands and feet on the ground. Zeke looked at what was happening, and with a smile on his face, he praised Ike's excellent work. After a while, the fire went out and black ashes remained from the monster, from which the remnants of smoke emanated. Zeke slowly began to move in the direction of the monster. The boys stood in place and watched their father's actions. Zeke approached the remains of the monster. He pushed aside the coals, and there was a small crystal on the ground. Then Zeke said that after a successful fight, you need to remember to pick up the magic stone. Zeke took the stone in his hand and continued to say that then this stone should be taken to the guild and they will buy a magic stone from you. The remnants of the monster flared up again. Zeke held a staff in his hands and said that he definitely needed to make sure that the remnants of the monsters were burned. There would be a lot of problems if the monsters turned into undead. The fire stopped burning. This time, there was nothing left of the monster. The guys and Zeke were looking at the ashes. Zeke held the bag on his shoulder and said that they had completed everything and it was time for them to move on. Mars's face was red. He looked at his father with a smile on his face and said that the next time they met a monster, he also wanted to use his magic. Zeke held the staff in his hand. He looked at Mars and with a smile on his face said that unfortunately, wind magic could not defeat monsters, so Mars could not fight monsters. Mars closed his eyes and smiled broadly. Then he said that in battle, he uses wind blades, not the wind itself. He was wearing a jacket and shirt on Mars. Zeke's face changed a lot. Sweat dripped down his face. Zeke opened his mouth and eyes wide in surprise and began to shout that Mars had already mastered wind blades. Zeke was wearing gloves and a button-down jacket. Mars replied to his father with a smile on his face that he learned how to use wind blades when he tried different tricks with the wind. A tuft of hair on the top of Mars's head stuck up. Zeke smiled nervously, one hand holding his staff, the other holding on to the strap of the bag that hung on his shoulder. Zeke looked at his son and said that in this case they could try to attack monsters from Mars. Mars smiled back at his father. The guys ended up in another place. Zeke made a strange sound again, and several goblins noticed him. The monsters ran to the place where the guys were standing. Mars put his hand forward. He had to attack the monsters after Zeke's attack. Mars frowned and waited for the monsters to approach. The monster began to grin and swing its clawed paw. Ike had to attack the monsters with his sword. Mars put his hand out and waited for the right moment to attack the monsters. Mars' hand began to glow. Ike was standing behind him. He was armed with a sword. Zeke was standing next to the guys and cheering them on. Mars held one hand in front of him and launched a wind blade attack. One of the monsters was beheaded. Zeke frowned and smiled maliciously. Zeke held up a magic staff in front of him and launched an attack on one of the monsters. Ike held a sword in his fists and began to quickly approach the remaining monster. Then Ike struck at him as well. Zeke activated his abilities, and the monsters' bodies began to burn. Mars took a crystal from one of the monsters. Zeke put his hands on his son's heads and said that the guys had done a good job. They needed to continue working and then return home. In the area that was surrounded by forest, the sounds of battle could be heard. Mars held his hand out in front of him and conjured. Mars's face had a serious expression. Ike was frowning and armed with his sword, which he used to strike. Ike pointed his sharp sword at the side where the defeated monster lay, his eyes closed. Ike pointed his hand at the monster and used a fire spell. Mars was nearby. In the next moment, Ike realized something. Ike raised his hands and looked at them. Then he said in surprise that his level had increased. A flickering glow and the table with improved characteristics appeared around Ike. The fire continued to burn in the same way with Ike. Zeke stood aside. He held his staff in his hands and, with a smile on his face, began to say that he congratulated the guys on their work, and now they can go home. Mars supported his father's words. Ike scratched his head in embarrassment and went to his relatives. After a while, the guys found themselves at home. Mars was sitting at the table and eating food. Then he stood on the grass and conjured, and after a while he found himself in bed. All this time, Mars thought that he was really waiting for his level to rise too. After a while, the guys found themselves in the forest. They looked at the accumulated crowd of goblins. Mars put his hands in front of him and thought that today he would definitely raise his level. The crowd of goblins noticed Mars pointing his arms in their direction. In the next instant, Mars activates his abilities and strikes with wind blades at the toothy monsters. All at once, the monsters started making scary noises. As soon as Mars finished the attack, his body began to shimmer brightly. Mars began to shine with joy as his level increased. The defeated monsters lay in an area that was surrounded by a forest area. Mars put his hand out. It was clenched into a fist, and began to shout loudly that his level had finally risen. Zeke and Ike were standing by the trees next to the monsters. Zeke put his hand on his belt and said with a smile on his face that it must be difficult for Mars to level up. Ike held a sword in his hands and started clapping as support for his brother. One monster lay motionless at the roots of a tree. The guys were standing next to each other. Mars looked back and said that there were not many goblins here. There were a huge number of motionless monster bodies lying between the trees. Zeke approached the bodies of the monsters and said that this was really abnormal. It was worth reporting to the guild. Zeke frowned and thought that in 2 days they had dealt with too many monsters. It was not good. The guys were at home. Zeke was sitting on a chair and began to say that too many monsters began to appear in Almeria. Adventurers tirelessly cleaned them up. Due to a lack of people, the guild was forced to change the task. The whole family was sitting at the table. Zeke put his hands on the table and said it would be a dangerous expedition, so Zeke wants to hear the family's opinion. Ike put his hands on the table and said that he thought they should go there together. There was a cup with a drink on the table next to Ike. Ike looked in front of him and enthusiastically said that he could help if there were only goblins there. Maria got angry and started shouting that there would be not only goblins in that place, but suddenly there would be other monsters that are much stronger than goblins. It is very dangerous. There was a mug of drink in front of Mars. He looked in front of him and with a smile on his face said that he was still not strong enough, so he would give up this hike. Mars put his hands on the table and said with a smile on his face that his father could refuse this assignment. Ike was looking at his brother intently. Zeke kept his hands on the table and was silent. Zeke took a mug with a drink in his hand and began to say that he was ready to postpone this task, but offered to go, as usual, to destroy monsters and gain experience. The guys unanimously agreed with their father's proposal. After a while, a monster with a dog's head appeared in front of the guys. Zeke said one kobold was nothing. A table with characteristics appeared next to the monster. The OZ index was equal to 15. There were an endless number of dog-headed monsters around the guys. Zeke nervously continued to say that a whole horde of kobolds is already a problem. Mars stood in a fighting position, and Ike took a fighting position. He held his sword in his hands. The next moment, the guys started running away. Zeke, with a smile on his face, said that at such moments it was better to retreat and then deal with the monsters one at a time. Zeke abruptly turned around and looked at the monsters with a smile on his face. Zeke and the boys turned around to attack the monsters. The crowd of monsters grinned and began to release their claws. Zeke shouted that he and the guys should defeat these monsters. Then Zeke, with a smile on his face, struck one of the monsters in the head. Mars and Ike were engrossed in a battle, swinging and striking. A large number of monsters kept coming and coming. They extended their claws and bared their toothy mouths. Ike held his sword with both hands and repelled the attacks of the toothy monsters. Then Ike started hitting the monsters. Mars put his hand out in front of him and activated his windblade ability. The monsters began to lose their heads. The guys were standing at the edge of the forest, with a bag lying on the ground between them. The guys exchanged glances and decided to go home. Also, their characteristics appeared together with the guys. Over the past month, their characteristics have improved significantly. Ike had a sword on his shoulder. Mars walked beside him. A backpack hung on his back. The guys were moving away from the dying fire. All the actions took place at the edge of the forest. Mars's sister was sleeping in a crib. Her hair had grown out. Mars looked at his sister with a smile on his face and thought that it was time to tell about the heavenly eye. The whole family was sitting at the table. There were many plates of food on the table. Mars broke the silence and called his parents. They started looking at him in surprise. Mars's face was slightly red, and with a smile on his face, he began to say that it seemed to him that he could now use the analysis skill. Maria and Zeke opened their mouths in surprise. They couldn't say a word, as they were shocked by what Mars had said. Zeke frowned and began to nervously say that Mars really could see the statuses of the people around him. There was a plate of food, a spoon, and a glass of drink in front of Mars. Mars smiled and replied to his father that his father was right, plus he could see the statuses of objects. Ike got up from his chair and pointed his fingers at the class. The parents began to hug with joy. Zeke looked at Mars in surprise, who said that they could discuss the expedition to Almeria again. Mars was standing on the floor. He clenched his hands into a fist and said that he thought there were too many goblins here. It would be nice to figure out what was going on. Zeke looked at Mars in surprise. He was a little shocked by what his son said. Maria held on to Zeke. She looked at him with a smile and said that she agreed with Mars. It wasn't such a bad idea. Zeke looked at the bottom and replied that this idea really sounds good. Then Zeke looked at the smiling children and said that the guys had grown up quickly. Zeke put his hands on his belt and said with a smile on his face that he would pick up the personal assignments tomorrow. The guys looked at their father and agreed with his decision. Maria stood behind. She held her hands together and looked at the family members with a smile on her face. The next day came. Fluffy clouds were floating across the sky. The whole family gathered at the horse cart. Maria held her daughter in her arms and listened to Zeke. He said that the guild was grateful that they agreed to complete the task. The boys got into the cart, and the cart began to drive. Ike waved goodbye to his mother. Maria held the house in her arms and said that the guys should be careful. The road led to mountains and an unusual figure. Zeke held the reins. Mars sat next to him and said that if they followed this road to the west, then where would they come to? Zeke replied that they would come to the mine. It had been abandoned for a long time. A monster appeared on the horizon. Mars instantly coped with it. The guys drove past the monster. He was lying headless on the ground and burning. Ike was sitting in the wagon and looking around the area. An old wooden sign appeared on the edge of the road. The guys looked down in surprise. They were on a ledge. In the large area where the stone buildings were located, there were a huge number of goblins. They communicated, lit bonfires, and slept on the ground. The guys were standing on the hill. Zeke started shouting at the goblins to pay attention to him. Then Ike jumped down the hill to the goblins. Ike put his hand in front of him and started burning monsters. The goblins looked at Ike, who appeared in fright. Ike picked up his sword and took up a fighting stance. A crowd of goblins roared and started running at Ike. Ike frowned and smiled maliciously. As soon as the goblins approached Ike, he dodged and jumped aside. After a while, Zeke and Mars put their hands in front of them and began to conjure. Ike was standing next to his father and Mars. The guys started using magic to attack the monsters. A barrage of attacks descended on the goblins. They began to make loud noises. Mars was covered in sweat. He wiped his face with his hand and then said that they did a great job. He also raised the level. Then Mars took out a magic crystal from the fire. The characteristics in the table have increased significantly since last time. Mars held a magic crystal in his hands. Then he looked in the direction from where Ike had called Zeke. Zeke held a baton in one hand and a backpack strap in the other. Zeke looked in the direction Ike was calling him from. The guys were surrounded by two-story stone buildings. Zeke stood in place and looked up in surprise. The guys were standing behind him and also looked up in surprise. The guys found themselves at a large wooden door. The guys started to discuss in surprise where this door leads. After a while, the door creaked and began to open. In the crack of the opening door, a large number of angry monsters began to be seen. Zeke opened his mouth in surprise, and they slightly raised the hand that held the magic wand. The guys stood there and also opened their mouths in surprise. A large number of small goblins came out of the building, and there was one big goblin among them. He had a high level of HP and stamina. Zeke looked at the monster and said that it was a hobgoblin, and they were tenacious and hardy. Zeke threw the bag on the ground and got into a fighting pose. Then he said that first they needed to destroy the goblins, and then they would go after the hobgoblin. Mars stood still and looked up. Ike picked up his sword and was ready to attack. Mars put his hands in front of him and began to conjure wind magic. At this time, Ike was running towards the monsters. Ike was running towards the big goblin. Flanked by small goblins, they began to be cut apart by the magical attack of Mars. The big goblin had both ears pierced. The wind attack was heading for the goblin. The attack caught up with the monster. It hit him right in the chest. The monster cringed in pain and clenched his teeth with all his might. The next moment, Ike was in the air. He was armed with a sword and was advancing on the big goblin. Ike's face was frowning and serious. The goblin noticed Ike. The veins on the goblin's face began to swell with anger, and he began to grin. Ike almost caught up with the big goblin, but the goblin gritted his teeth and repelled Ike's attack. Ike started to deflect the blow with his sword. Then he landed on the ground and was ready to launch a new attack. Ike pushed off the ground and rushed forward. At this time, Mars put his hands in front of him. He furrowed his eyebrows and was ready to launch another attack on the big goblin. Zeke shouted that Mars should aim at the big goblin's eyes. Mars makes an attack on the monster, along with an armed Ike. A large goblin with pierced ears held out his hand in front of him to repel the wind attack of Mars. The big goblin opened its mouth. The wind attack passed by the monster's paw and hit it in the face. Ike was rushing forward, his face very serious. When Ike ran towards the big goblin, he held his sword in his hand. As soon as Mars's attack hit the monster's muzzle, it opened its mouth and began to make loud noises, just as the monster began to cover its muzzle with clawed paws. After a while, Ike found himself in the air above the big goblin. A large goblin was standing on the ground. He was covering his muzzle with his clawed paws. There was also an abrasion on the monster's chest from Mars's attack. Ike approached the monster and struck at it. Then Ike landed on his feet. He spread his arms out to the sides. In one hand he held his sword. Ike's gaze was serious, and his eyebrows were heavily furrowed. Ike got to his feet, and behind him lay the body of a large goblin and several bodies of small goblins. Zeke said with a smile on his face that Ike had done a good job. Ike picked up the magic crystal that was in the big goblin. Ike looked at the crystal in surprise and said that the crystal was surprisingly huge. Zeke was standing behind and lighting a fire. Then he looked fearfully through the crack of the door. There was a gloomy atmosphere in the back of the room. Zeke cautiously began to say that this was a maze. If the goblins poured out of here, then it could become a serious problem. Other monsters could come from there. Zeke was standing by the big door. Mars began to go to his father and tell him what plan they would follow next. Zeke looked at his son and replied that they needed to look around. Zeke looked away and continued to say that if there are goblins in the room, they will inform the guild that the monsters are coming from here. The guy started walking into the gloomy room. The building was lined with large bricks. The doors themselves, which led into the room, were old and rusted. The boys also agreed with their father's decision. The big door that led into the gloomy room slammed shut. Zeke held a magic staff in his hand and walked in front, with the guys walking behind him. Gloomy and frightening sounds were heard in the room. Zeke held a magic staff in his hand. Then he lifted it and pointed at another door. Zeke was looking at another door and started saying that he and the guys should inspect this area and then turn back. The door creaked and opened a crack. Zeke went into the room. There were several creatures standing there, and Zeke was scared when he noticed them. 3 robed monsters held staffs in their hands. A table with characteristics appeared next to the monsters. They possessed the magic of the earth. Zeke and the guys hid behind a wall. Zeke held a magic staff in his hands and told the guys that these monsters were goblin magicians. The guys stood behind Zeke and looked at the monsters in surprise. Zeke was standing behind the wall. He looked towards the monsters and started saying that monsters use magic, so it won't be so easy to eliminate them. Torches shone in the room, and vases lay on the floor. The monsters stood and looked in the direction of the guys. The guys, along with Zeke, armed themselves and rushed to the attack. Zeke held a magic staff in front of him and shouted that it was necessary to destroy the monsters before they cast a spell, so you need to act very quickly. Zeke was walking towards the monsters with a smile on his face. Ike and Mars were frowning and serious. The goblin magicians noticed the guys who were rushing at them and were very scared. Mars put his hand in front of him and began to conjure. Ike began to attack monsters with his sword, and Zeke struck with his staff. A satisfied smile could be seen on his face. Ike started burning goblin bodies. Zeke walked forward and found himself at the chest. Zeke looked at Mars and said that Mars should scan the chest with analysis. Maybe it's a trap. Mars's eyes changed as he activated the ability. Next to the chest that stood on the floor, a characteristic appeared. Its contents depend on the luck of the person who opens it. Mars looked at his father and said that the chest was not dangerous and the contents depended on luck points. Zeke walked up to Mars. He looked at the chest and said with a smile that, in that case, Mars should open this chest. Mars was looking warily in the direction where the chest stood. Mars walked over to the chest and began to open it with care. Mars started to open the chest, and there was a creak. Mars's eyes sparkled as soon as he saw the contents of the chest. There was a fire bracelet in the chest. A characteristic appeared next to the bracelet. It added 4 points to magic and had a sea level. Ike raised his arm, which was wearing a bracelet, and shouted with delight that this would make his fire even stronger. Zeke and Mars were standing nearby, looking at Ike and rejoicing at their success. There was a bright sky above the guild building, with clouds floating across it. The guys ended up in the guild building. Zeke looked in front of him and said that they had come with a report to the guildmaster. Zeke was flanked by surprised guys. The guys were standing at the reception desk. Zeke went on to say that his children would go with him. There were tables in the room where men sat and drank from wooden mugs. A girl in a suit was standing at the reception desk. The guys found themselves in another room. There were large shelves in the room which were lined with books. There was an older man sitting at the table in front of the shelves, and he started saying that Zeke had done a great job. There were many wrinkles on the man's face. The man looked at Zeke and said in surprise that Zeke could tell about these children. There was also a large window in the room. Zeke pointed at the children and said they were his sons, Mars and Ike. Ike and Mars smiled. Then they introduced themselves and said they were very pleased to meet the guildmaster. The man got up and walked to the edge of the desk. Then the man said his name was Ralph Sargent. Zeke and the guys were looking at Ralph. Ralph was a little surprised when Zeke started saying that he and the guys had come to talk about the quest they were on. Zeke started to remember the monsters they had to meet. Then he said that the back in the abandoned village turned into a maze. They saw a hobgoblin and goblin magicians there. Zeke frowned and said that the maze had just begun to grow. If it continued like this, then they would face big problems. Ralph was sweating and panicking. Ralph hunched his shoulders a little and said that he would report the news to Count Carmel. Zeke was standing in front of Ralph. The guys were standing behind Zeke. There was a large closed door behind Ike and Mars. The guys looked ahead with smiles on their faces. Zeke started saying that he would like to register the children as adventurers. Zeke began to recall the skillful attacks of the guys and continued to say that the children accompanied him in exploring the maze, and if they had not eaten, Zeke would not have been able to learn so much information. Ralph straightened up. He began to scratch the back of his head nervously and then said that Zeke was sure of it. The guys were still just kids. Zeke replied with a smile on his face that Ike could wield a sword, a spear, and fire magic, and Mars could use Vera magic. Ralph frowned. He didn't believe Zeke's words. Ralph opened his mouth in surprise when he saw the guys. The guys unanimously agreed with their father's words and began to activate their abilities. Ike put his hands in front of him and conjured fire, and wind appeared around Mars. Ralph held out his hand in front of him and started shouting loudly that he agreed he would register Ike and Mars as adventurers himself. The guys' faces turned red and they began to smile at the happy news. Then the guys shouted with one voice that they were grateful to Ralph. They screamed so loudly that they could be heard on the street. Night gradually fell. After a while, the guys found themselves at home. Sounds of fighting began to be heard near the house. Ike began to be lifted from the earth of Mars. Mars began to praise his brother's abilities. Ike replied that Mars was exaggerating. He would become much more capable over time. Ike was helping to lift Marsa with a sword in his hands and a smile on his face. Zeke was standing nearby and started calling the guys. A smile appeared on Zeke's face as soon as he heard that the guys were glad to see him. The whole family found themselves at a wooden table. Zeke put his hands on the table and started saying that it was time for them to talk about the award. They got 3 of them, so they would share it between 3. Ike lifted his arm with the bracelet and pointed at it with his finger. Then Ike smiled and said that the fire bracelet would be enough for him. Mars put his hands on the table and, with a smile on his face, said that he would like to study the magic of the earth. It would be enough for him if Zeke would help him with this. The parents looked at their sons in surprise. Then they started laughing loudly and covering their mouths. Zeke put his hand to his face and said through laughter that the guys were in their repertoire. Zeke agreed to teach the magic of Mars. Zeke took out the adventurer's cards and handed them to the guys. The guys began to look at the adventurer's cards with delight. Maria looked at Zeke in surprise when he said that a request had been received from the guildmaster and Count Carmel. Zeke put his hands together and, with a serious expression on his face, said that they wanted him and the guys to join other adventurers in exploring the maze. As a reward, they promised the title of Baron. What did the guys think about it? Maria blushed and agreed to the proposal with a smile on her face. Ike and Mars, with a smile on their faces, also agreed to Zeke's proposal. Zeke smiled and said that that was fine and they should get to work. After a while, a long line of people walked out of the city. Along the road, along with people, carts were moving, which were crowded with horses. Woody and shrubby vegetation grew on the sides of the road. 6 months have passed. There were a lot of people in the square. Mars and his family were among them. Mars and Maria discussed the successful completion of the tests. Tables with improved characteristics appeared next to the guys. Zeke was holding a bag on his shoulder. He stared and saw a crowd of people. The man with long hair began to greet Zeke and thank him for his work. A man with long hair was smiling, and several people were standing next to him. A girl in a witch's hat was holding a little girl in her arms. It was a group called Blue Fang. They had a D rank. The girl was smiling broadly and stretching her arms forward. Maria, with a smile on her face, began to say that she was grateful to the guys for looking after Lena. There was a beautiful house on the territory. Its roof was covered with tiles. There were many useful buildings on the territory of the courtyard. It was Baron Bryant's house. The whole family, except Lena, was sitting at a wooden table with mugs of drink on it. Zeke smiled and said that he suggested exploring the maze deeper. Then Zeke frowned and continued to say that they were getting married in the evening. The guys should be ready. The guys looked at their father and unanimously agreed with his application. Zeke found himself at the door that led to the maze. He asked if everyone was ready. If so, then it was time for them to move out. Zeke was not alone at the maze. Maria was with him. Ike, he held a stick in his hands, and Mars, he held a knife in his hands and smiled. The whole family found themselves in a stone room. There were various monsters in front of them. The family stood in the doorway, and Zeke said that Ike and Mars would be able to cope with these monsters on their own. The guys unanimously agreed to the father's question. Then the guys started walking towards where there were many small ones and one huge monster. The monsters began to prepare for the attack. A fog formed under their feet. The guys rushed forward abruptly. Ike was holding a stick in his hands, and his sword was on his back. Mars was holding a knife that was wrapped in wind magic. A crowd of small goblins ran forward to attack the guys. Ike furrowed his brows heavily. Then he stared and took hold of the stick with both hands. A light shone on Ike's face, and he clenched his teeth hard to deliver a powerful blow to the monsters. As soon as the monsters approached Ike, he began to attack the monsters with all his might. One by one, the monsters began to fly away in different directions. The monsters that were standing to the side watched Ike's attacks in fright. Monsters were coming at Ike from all sides. Goblin magicians stood to the side and began aiming their magic wands at Ike. One of the monsters gritted his teeth and started attacking Ike with a magic staff. Ike was standing still. Suddenly, Mars appears in front of him. Mars hovers in the air and, with the help of his magic, repels the attack of the goblin magician. Several goblin magicians, seeing Mars, were very scared. Mars held a knife in his hands and began to move towards the monsters. After a while, Mars made the fastest attack and ended up behind the monsters. The monsters were illuminated by the light and the attack of Mars. Mars landed on the floor. He tried to get up from his knees, but a huge goblin loomed over him, which began to swing at Mars. Mars noticed the goblin and began to shorten. Mars jumped to the side, and the goblin struck the ground. Mars hovered in the air. He frowned and remembered his father's words that you need to aim at the eyes of monsters and attack them. Mars made an attack with a knife that was wrapped in wind magic. Mars's attack hit the big goblin squarely in the eyes. Mars landed on the floor in front of the monster. The monster fell to one knee and began to cover his eyes from the pain. Then the monster began to make scary noises loudly. At this time, Ike did not think for long. He picked up a spear and began to aim. Soon he threw a sharp spear at the intended target. The spear's speed was very fast. Ike aimed at the monster, which was covering its face with clawed paws. The spear flew past Mars, who was standing in front of the monster. After Ike's attack, the monster collapsed to the ground. The guys started looking towards where the wooden chest was. After a while, a new spear appeared in Ike's hands. Ike raised the spear above his head and began to admire it enthusiastically. A table with characteristics appeared next to the spear. It was a fire spear. It added 20 points to the attack. The whole family gathered at the place and walked down the corridor. Ike left his old spear against the wall. Mars was leading the way. After a while, Zeke's face began to shine with joy, and he smiled broadly. Zeke stood in the hallway and looked at the door, which began to glow brightly. In the corridor, there were branches to the right, to the left, and to the front. After leaving the hallowed door, Mars and her family found themselves on the street. Zeke broke the silence and said they would rest for a while in a safe area. The sun shone on the shrubby plants and the area where they grew. Mars and his family are sitting on the grass. They spread a blanket and sat down on it to rest for a while. Zeke and his wife looked at each other and laughed. Mars and Ike enjoyed eating their food. Lush plants grew behind the guys. After a while, Mars lay down on the blanket. He put his hands on his stomach and fell asleep. His knife was lying on the bedspread next to Mars. Its improved characteristics had been discovered next to Mars. After a while, Mars and his family found themselves back in a gloomy cave. They went down the stairs and found themselves in a room with monsters. Marsa and his family were on the second floor, surrounded by small and large monsters on all sides. Mars and the whole family began to smile maliciously. Then the sounds of fighting and fighting began to be heard throughout the corridor. Mars and his family were standing at the big door, in a huge room. Torches burned on either side of the gate. Zeke was holding a bag on his shoulder and said that these gates were too big. On the other side of the room, the bodies of the defeated monsters lay on the floor. The door creaked open. Mars and his family stood in the doorway and stared in front of them. Several huge monsters were also looking at them. Mars and his family armed themselves and took up fighting positions. The big goblins were looking at the guys and preparing to make an attack. Behind the big goblins stood a huge goblin in armor and weapons in his paws. Zeke looked at all the monsters in fright. A huge goblin in armor and with a weapon in his paws stood in place. Mars looked at the monster in fright and activated his assessment ability. It was a goblin general. He was strong, agile, and had good stamina. Mars looked at his parents. They put their hands in front of them and started aiming at the monsters. The parents began to discuss with smiles on their faces that the Goblin King was waiting for them at the very end. The guys should watch their parents fight. The Goblin General thrust his weapon forward and let out a terrible roar. The smaller goblins rushed to attack the guys. Zeke began to cast a spell called the Earth Fortress, and Maria uttered the words of the spell of the Ice Fortress. A stone dome appeared above Zeke, and a dome of many crystals appeared above Maria. At this, a loud noise was heard. The goblins began attacking the protective domes of Zeke and Maria. The Goblin General began to push aside the other goblins and move towards the domes. Then the Goblin General began to swing his sharp weapon. The Goblin General unleashed a barrage of crushing blows on the protective domes of Zeke and Maria. The rest of the goblins stood to the side and watched what was happening. At one time, Maria and Zeke began to kill themselves viciously. Then they furrowed their eyebrows and said that now was the time to make an attack. The next moment, there is a brilliant flash of light. Then the goblins began to be pierced by stones and crystals. Ike held his new spear on his shoulder and stared at what was happening with Mars in surprise. The Goblin General stood in place and covered his wounded body with his hands. Half of the armor and weapons were scattered by Zeke and Maria's attack. Even the goblin's helmet was damaged. The goblin froze in place with its mouth open and a blank stare. After a moment, the Goblin General collapsed to the ground and stopped moving. The helmet from the Goblin General's head rolled to the side. The rest of the monsters' bodies were lying next to the Goblin General. They also did not move. Marie was holding a staff. Zeke was also holding a staff. At the same time, the parents turned to their mothers and said that how the children evaluate from strength. Mars was holding a knife in his hands, and Ike was holding his new spear. The guys approached their parents and said with smiles on their faces that their parents had done well. Marie put her hand to her lips and laughed shyly. Meanwhile, the sun was shining in the city of Labyrinth Grants. There were a large number of multi-story buildings on the territory of the city. The cat climbed onto the girl's lap and began to scratch her clothes. The girl was sitting on her lap and hugging the cat with a smile on her face. The girl and the cat looked in surprise in the direction from where a young man was running towards them and calling the girl. The girl ended up in one of the houses of the city. She went into a room where there were many beds and wounded men lay on them. The girl stood in the doorway and tried to catch her breath. The man with the bandaged head and body got up from the bed. His body was shaking all over. The man waved his hand and said that he was sorry for the trouble, but would Clarice be able to treat him? The girl went to the wounded man. The girl was standing in the room. She raised her arms and closed her eyes, and a magical light began to appear in the girl's hands. Behind the girl was a door and a closet with various items. The girl smiled. She opened her eyes slightly and began to cast a healing spell. A strand of the girl's hair was braided into a pigtail. Torches are burning brightly on the massive stone wall, on which every brick is literally visible. One of the Goblin Generals emerged from the floor thanks to a rather intricate magical seal. His friend is lying next to him, looking at him uncomprehendingly. The father of the two brothers says that they got into the Goblin General's room, and that even if they take away these creatures' lives, they will still come to life again. There is a small stone bunker behind the boys, from which the parents are visible. The father tells the boys to gain experience in this place for their future battles. The other one wishes the guys good luck. The boys don't pay much attention to them. The goblins continue to surround the heroes, trying to corner them. The boys do not give up and continue to hold the line. The parents, sitting in a stone bunker, shout to the heroes to defeat all the goblin generals. Finally, the heroes decide to attack the goblins. There's a huge amount of enthusiasm and determination on their faces. The young men are full of confidence in their victory and are not going to deviate from their plans. They nod in agreement to the commanders from the bunker. Goblins are not going to lose. They are also completely confident in their victory. Their not very attractive faces also show determination and confidence in their victory. They are not ready to lose to outsiders and uninvited guests. A young man with white hair aggressively rushes to attack the monsters. His friend is not far behind him. He also attacks monsters without feeling a drop of pity for them. The young men mercilessly chop down the goblins' bodies, not wanting to lose. Goblins, on the other hand, fight off the heroes, trying to protect their exposed areas of the body. When they throw the characters away from themselves, it's more like throwing away rag dolls that fall so inappropriately from above. The hero with white hair, even after he was thrown down, rises again and is about to attack the goblin again. In a leap, he swings a small blade, preparing to strike an opponent so great in comparison with him. As a result, Mars gets to the goblin's vulnerable spot, namely his neck. He passes the blade with all his might through the goblin's flesh, which is not covered in armor. This action causes quite a lot of damage to the monster. It happens over and over again, day after day, throughout the year. As a result, the dungeon becomes filled with a huge pile of stones, so much so that the very floor of the dungeon is practically invisible. The heroes stand proudly, having emerged from this difficult battle victorious. Mars's level rose to 14 and Ike's boys to 19. At the end of the battle, the parents who were sitting in it all the time of the battle also leave their bunker. One of them praises the heroes, saying that they did a great job and did a pretty good job. His companion stands silently beside him without uttering a word. Then he says that they can move on to new adventures and training. He has a confident and calm smile on his face. He is looking somewhere ahead, trying to explore further terrain. Then the gaze of all the characters falls on the stairs leading to the third floor. The heroes climb it and discover something amazing. All of them even have their mouths open because of what they saw in front of them. They are faced with a huge and massive gate decorated with a stone goblin head, from which ornate patterns emanate. One of the heroes says that it looks like these gates lead to the boss's room. Then, a gloved hand rests on the heavy stone gate. Its owner begins to put pressure on the gate with all his might, trying to open it. It turned out to be the father of the young men who fought goblins in the dungeon. He opens the gate, saying that it's time for them to move on, forward. All the heroes, singing behind him with great determination, look into the opening passage. As a result, they end up in the boss's room. They are faced with a huge room, at the end of which there is a throne on which someone is sitting, and the throne itself is guarded by two knights, rather small in stature. When the heroes manage to get closer, they can take a closer look at the knights guarding the throne. Their faces express nothing but anger and neutrality. The hilts of their swords are tightly clenched in their hands. These are the Goblin Lords. On the throne, located at the end of the room, sits the Goblin King. His face is full of arrogance and contempt for intruders. He also clutches the hilt of his sword in his hands, as do his guards. The goblin sits rather impressively on the throne. Suddenly, an inexplicable anger distorts his face. The face is obscured by darkness so much that only the whites of the eyes become visible. The faces of the heroes at this moment are distorted by tension. They don't know what to expect from the Goblin King at this moment. The white-haired young man assumes that this goblin can use magic. Suddenly, the young men stand in a stance, preparing for action. At the same time, they turn to their parents. Their voices are full of determination. Parents, hearing such a tone in the voices of their children, were greatly surprised, at the same time tensed and wary. They didn't even know what their children were up to. The boys also took defensive poses, preparing for battle with such strong and powerful opponents, such as Goblin Lords, and asked their parents to leave them on them. The Goblin Lords were already ready to attack the intruders too. As a result, the guys rushed to attack their opponents dressed in such strong and durable armor. There was determination and confidence in their victory on the faces of the guys. The Goblin Lords also decided to keep up with them and also rushed to attack. It was clearly visible on their faces that they were not going to lose to some kids. The guys rushed at the opponents with all their determination, not wanting to give them the victory. Around them, only the swinging of swords could be seen, and the sounds of blades slicing through the air and flesh of monsters could be heard. Their parents froze in surprise. As a result, the guys quickly dealt with the opponents, namely the Goblin Lords. They eventually fell into lifeless bags, and the guys went to deal with the boss of this dungeon. But he was ready for this outcome of events, so he immediately rushed to meet his evil opponents. He swung his sword with a devilish smile, intending to cut the heroes in half, whereas they weren't going to let that happen. As a result, one of the brothers managed to repel the Goblin King's blow, and the second one inflicted damage on him. At the moment of deflecting the Goblin King's blow, the young man's face showed no hefty tension and resistance to the goblin's power. Then the opponents dispersed to different sides of the room to increase the distance between them. They performed this trick in the air, so everyone's landing caused a huge amount of noise. Then, when the heroes dispersed, they looked at each other carefully, but neither of them lowered his sword. They were not going to let down their guard so as not to lose. The wound, which the boys had only recently left to the Goblin King, healed almost instantly, filling the room with a quiet hiss produced by almost instantaneous regeneration. The goblin waited patiently for his wound to heal. Then, after it finally happened, he smiled nastily and smugly at his opponents, as if showing his superiority over them. His wound had healed so well that after being struck by the sword on the skin, there was not even a scar left. Then the fight continued. The heroes, like the Goblin King, rushed to the attack, trying to inflict as much damage as possible on the enemy. They rushed at the Goblin King, fiercely holding spears and swords in front of them. Finally, a full-fledged and fierce battle began. The metallic sound of clashing swords and spears flew through the air, which also cut through the air. The opponents were shortened from each other's blows, trying not to get hit. The Goblin King tried to sneak attack one of the brothers. With great malice and contempt on his face, he was already preparing to deliver a crushing blow that would most likely blow off the head of one of the brothers. But at that very moment, the second brother intervened, who managed to prevent this blow and save his brother from death. But he was able to hold the Goblin King's huge sword with his small blade. At this time, the second brother ducked under the goblin's sword to execute the planned maneuver. At the moment when the goblin finally opened, the young man managed to throw his spear at him, which was able to hit the target accurately, piercing the Goblin King's side. He was quite surprised by the foreign object stuck in his body. Then the Goblin King decided to pull out a spear that one of the brothers had plunged into him. He wrapped his arm tightly around it and began to pull, trying to remove it from his flesh. While the Goblin King started pulling him out, he also decided to use his sword to get rid of one of his opponents. The goblin, with a nasty smile, began to take out the blade from behind his back. Then he swung it at one of the brothers, trying to take his life again. By this action, he caused genuine surprise and fright in the young man. As a result, a second before the goblin's sword would have cut him, the young man managed to dodge and bounce away, not allowing the opponent to inflict damage on himself. The Goblin King's sword hit the stone floor of the dungeon with a powerful clang. The parents, seeing this picture, immediately rushed to their son. When they shouted out the name of the son they had just practically lost, their voices were full of anxiety and worry. Ike, on the other hand, was sitting on one knee and holding the wound site on his forearm. Then he looked awkwardly at his parents, feeling guilty for making them worry, says he's fine and apologizes for letting his guard down. The young man still continues to hold his injured hand. At this time, his brother is distracted and shouts to Ike that he's about to fly up to him. But at this time, the Goblin King is going to attack him from behind. The monster has already swung his sword and is preparing to strike at Mars. But he notices in time the blade of the Goblin King's blade flying towards him. Although the hero's eyes freeze with fright and surprise, and it seems that he is unable to move because of these feelings, but he still manages to dodge. He skips right under the Goblin King's sword. The sword swings over his head, but does not manage to do any harm. After dodging, Mars turns towards the enemy and thinks to himself that he will not let him heal his brother. The hero's face expresses a vivid disgust for his opponent. Then Mars decides to fight the Goblin King alone. His face expresses determination and self-confidence. As a sign of readiness, Mars puts his small blade forward towards the enemy. Goblin is only glad of this outcome. Excitement lights up in his eyes. He also puts his massive sword forward as a sign of readiness. The monster is preparing to attack its opponent again. Then the battle continues. The opponents strike each other more and more blows, trying to cause each other irreversible damage. During the fight, they move to different sides of the room, and their fight does not stay in one place for a long time. Over time, it becomes more and more difficult for the hero to reflect the blows of the Goblin King. A certain weariness and heaviness from what is happening is expressed on his face. He tries his best to deflect the goblin's blows. But at some point, he can't stand the onslaught and flies into the wall, unable to withstand a sword strike from a goblin. The loud sound of the impact reverberates throughout the room, but the hero manages to stay alive and unharmed. He hangs on the wall like a lizard and starts watching the opponent's actions. The goblin, standing below, continues to swing his massive sword, waiting for Mars to descend from the wall and continue the fight with him. Suddenly, the hero puts the sword blade forward and, pushing off from the wall, heads towards the opponent. The goblin was just waiting for this. He puts his sword forward in readiness to continue the fight and smiles maliciously, absorbed in excitement and counting on his victory, since only some boy is against him. The boy flies at full speed towards the enemy, intending to inflict irreparable damage to him. In addition, he also wants to take revenge on the Goblin King for injuring his brother and for not letting him heal him. The boy is getting closer and closer to the enemy. They both swing at each other, hoping to neutralize their opponent as much as possible. When the distance becomes very small, both the hero and the goblin begin to fully attack each other. As a result, the goblin, having made his swing, misses without even hitting the hero, who managed to evade the enemy's blow, while Mars delivers the strongest blow to the Goblin King's leg. The latter, not expecting such a maneuver from the boy, is very surprised and even, in a sense, scared. The hero continues to attack the enemy. This time, he already attacks the Goblin King's throat and successfully cuts it. The Goblin King grabs his throat and bounces off Mars, trying to maximize the distance. The Goblin King then uses magic to create a seal. Thanks to this seal, he manages to make a challenge to the monsters, which poured out in a huge crowd from the resulting similar seal on the floor. But the hero knew what could be done about it, so he decided to cause a huge flow of air, similar to a horizontal tornado. As a result, the hero managed to deal with all the monsters that the Goblin King managed to summon without much difficulty. Upon realizing this, the Goblin King was completely shocked. He did not understand how the boy could cope with such an army. Mars calmly approached his opponent, slightly thrusting his blade forward. Now, there was nothing around them but stone walls and a floor. The whole area was plunged into absolute silence. Then the hero, with a sweet, childish smile, extended the blade towards the opponent and calmly uttered the phrase that it looked like the Goblin King had used all his mana. Then the hero, with a light movement of the blade, cut off the head of the Goblin King from the body. A slight metallic sound swept through the room, and the monster's head slowly began to fall to the floor. Then the hero saw a sign that he had received the title of King of the Wind, which is given to those who are among the top 10 wind mages in the world, as well as the title of goblins. Then a chest opens in front of the hero, from which the mantle of the Ifrit flies out. The mantle looks quite large and unusual. Then the parents and brother run up to Mars. Mom hugs the young man and calls him a big, smart guy. The father, standing behind, says that they can consider that the two of them have cleared the dungeon. Mars then informs his father that he has received the titles of the Goblin Killer Wind King. The father looks at his son in surprise and joy, and then says that it's just wonderful and amazing. The action shifts to the next day in the maze city of Grantham. The sun is shining brightly, and it is quite warm outside. In one of the houses, a family consisting of a mother, father, and daughter is sitting and having breakfast in a rather cozy room. The room had a calm, friendly, and family atmosphere. Mom asks her daughter if she will go today. Her father asks her not to overexert herself. Their daughter's name is Clarissa. Parents look at their child with love. The girl looks at her parents with a smile and promises that she will not overexert herself. You can immediately understand that idle reigns in this family, since all its members treat each other with respect and affection. Then Clarissa goes on business that she needs to do in the city. She tells her parents about it with a happy smile so that they don't worry about her absence from home. The action moves to another building. It looks quite large and spacious. The building is a 2-story house with many windows. The girl, entering the house, stretches out her hand to someone's body and applies a healing spell. A bright ball of light emanates from her hand and directs its action to the part of the human body to which the girl's hand directs it. The man Clarissa treated says thank you to her and smiles gratefully at her. The girl continues the treatment and says that he has nothing to thank her for. The girl's face is full of seriousness and concentration. After Clarissa has finished treating this man, she asks the next patient to come over. The girl was a little tired dealing with one patient. This can be understood later as she wipes the sweat with her hand from her small forehead. Clarissa thinks to herself that she's had quite a few patients lately. By that time, it is already beginning to get dark outside. Evening is slowly but surely coming. The sun is sinking below the horizon. By the time Clarissa finishes, the sun has almost gone below the horizon. The city begins to sink into the darkness of a good night. The girl, having finished, goes home. Two men are walking towards her, talking about the morning return of a certain kobold. One reports this news, and the other clarifies whether it is true. The girl is already passing by them, when suddenly she hears the phrase that one of the men does not think it is worth worrying about the saturation of the maze. Upon hearing this phrase, Clarissa's face shows misunderstanding and bewilderment. As a result, the girl turns around to listen to the conversation of two men, one of whom asks the other about the saturation of the maze. Then the girl approaches a huge and architecturally similar building. Tall columns adorn its entrance, as well as the main facade. Thick steam is coming from the windows of the building. The girl looks in surprise at the high windows, from which thick and hot steam emanates. She first decides to come closer, and then decides to enter this building altogether. This building turned out to be one huge bathhouse. Clarissa decides to let herself relax in the hot tub, which relaxes the body so much. The girl, sinking into the water, exhales with relief. Besides her, there are also several other girls in the bathtub. They came here, like Clarissa, to relax and wash up. The girls swim calmly in the warm water. Some people walk outside the bathroom, choosing a different route of their pastime. Clarissa, with a joyful and happy face, thinks about how good she feels right now. The heat coming from the bathroom made the girl's cheeks flush. Her face is completely relaxed, as is her body. Then the girl continues to soak in the hot and long-awaited bathroom. The water completely envelops her body. The stone covering of the bathroom, heated by steam coming from the water, does not cool at all. The girl, as if in a trance, languidly opens her eyes. There is complete relaxation and serenity on her face. Then the girl plunges into the water up to the middle of her face and starts blowing bubbles. At the same time, she talks about the saturation of the maze. Clarissa is quite worried about this news, and she can't stop thinking about it. Then the girl thinks that she hopes that nothing bad will happen in the end. Life in the bathhouse continues to go on as usual. Clarissa, having finished her water treatments, finally decides to leave the bathhouse and head home. Leaving the building of the bathhouse, she thinks again about how good she is now. Suddenly, the girl's attention is attracted by a cat. The girl is touched by this fluffy animal, which was able to attract her attention. Looking at the animal, Clarissa's eyes almost sparkle with stars. She immediately approaches the cat and begins to caress and stroke it. The animal purrs, accepting the girl's caress. Clarissa continues to stroke the cat and smiles happily at the same time. The action is postponed for some time. A man explains to Clarissa that the number of monsters in the maze is predetermined, but for some reason their number continues to grow and they are banally cramped, which is called saturation of the maze. He then asks Clarissa if she has understood what the saturation of the maze is. At the moment of this question, his face is full of seriousness, and his arms are crossed over his chest. The girl looks at the man in confusion and says that she understood everything. But you can tell by the look on her face that Clarissa didn't fully understand everything. Then the girl adds that she only understood everything to some extent. During the entire conversation, they were sitting on the small veranda of a local diner. The rest of the guests were quietly enjoying their food during such a serious conversation. Then the man smiles amiably and says that you should not worry about this, because this happens very rarely. Another man with long blonde hair is sitting next to him and smiling calmly. At that moment, a waiter comes to their table and brings ice cream. At this point, the man tells Clarissa to start eating in gratitude for the treatment. The ice cream looks pretty nice and, most importantly, delicious. The girl, seeing the dessert, was very happy and greatly admired it. Extreme joy and happiness appeared in her eyes. Then she picked up a spoon and decided to try the long-awaited dessert. The first spoonful of ice cream caused the girl extreme delight. It was so delicious. Then the action shifts to the gates of the maze, where a certain man with jet-black hair was telling his subordinates that they would also go hunting monsters today to prevent the saturation of the maze. The man says that they are the knightly order of Count Beetle, so they will do their best for the common people and the Count. At the moment of this speech, his face expresses maximum seriousness and confidence in his words. The knights listen attentively to the man and nod in agreement. Each of them is clad in sturdy and massive armor. Everyone has a fairly long and sturdy spear in their hand, capable of dealing damage to monsters. Suddenly, the gate begins to shake, which causes genuine surprise among the audience. The soldiers look at the shaking gates of the maze with incomprehension and bewilderment. Their leader turns around after the soldiers. His face also shows a lack of understanding of what is happening. He had never seen the gates of the labyrinth shake before. He decides to come closer, hoping to understand the reason for the shaking of these so strong, massive gates located inside the stone wall. The shaking and strange sounds increase. Suddenly, the gate swings open and a huge number of maze monsters burst out. Their unpleasant faces are distorted with malice and rage. They are ready to destroy everything that gets in their way. The leader of the knightly order of Count Beetle looks with great surprise, complete incomprehension and bewilderment at the wave of monsters that is moving directly towards him. There is also a fear on his face that perhaps this wave will engulf him. As a result, this is practically what happens. A huge and powerful wave of monsters, falling out of the maze, falls directly on the leader of the Order of Count Beetle. He screams and tries to fight off such a huge pack of monsters. The monsters continue to climb over him, while the man shouts to his subordinates not to be afraid, although he himself is terrified from head to toe. A man is being eaten alive by monsters. But despite this, he shouts at the soldiers to keep formation and try not to let them into the city. The knights are struggling to fight off so many monsters and try to restrain them in order to keep the peace in the city. At this moment, a bell ringer rises to the observation tower, who initially just wanted to check the situation outside the city, but a terrifying sight appeared before his eyes. As soon as he saw what was happening outside the city, he was seized with the strongest fear and horror. Cold sweat became visible on his face. He was almost paralyzed with fear. Looking at everything that was happening, only one single thought came to his mind, namely the thought that trouble had happened. He immediately rushed to the bell and began to ring it fiercely in order to warn the townspeople of the disaster that had happened. At the same time, he began to notify residents that the saturation of the maze had occurred and that an urgent evacuation was needed. All the townspeople, hearing this, immediately caught a panic and began to run away in fear just to save their lives. The action shifts to Clarissa and her companions. The big man who was telling the girl about the saturation of the maze realizes that it looks like something terrible has happened. His companion also jumps to his feet, ready for action. They then head to the scene of the accident, having previously instructed Clarissa to head home immediately. The girl resolutely looks into the distance and thinks about her parents, who may be in danger right now. Suddenly, the girl hears that there is a wounded adventurer somewhere near her. The person next to him shouts out a question about whether there is someone nearby who can help. The girl lowers her head, thinking she does not know how to do the right thing, go to the aid of the wounded or go to a safe place, that is, to her home. The choice is quite difficult. From indecision, Clarissa tightly presses her hand, clenched into a fist, to her chest. Then she decides to go to the aid of the wounded to save the lives of the injured. She runs as fast as she can towards the wounded adventurer in order to help him. On the run, the girl shouts that she can help him. At this time, a battle is already underway within the walls of the city with monsters that have escaped from the maze. The man who communicated with Clarissa deals with the surging monsters without any problems. His companion does not lag behind him and just as deftly repels the attack of monsters. It takes only one swing of the sword for each monster. They are also helped by other citizens who are able to fight and have at least some experience in battles. Clarissa goes to help the wounded. She asks everyone if they are all right and, if necessary, provides them with the necessary help using her healing ability. Suddenly, a man with a mustache hears a familiar voice and words of gratitude behind him. It turned out to be Clarissa, helping the injured people. There was almost a whole queue of people waiting for treatment. The man, seeing this, was filled with a sense of duty and menacingly struck his mighty fists against each other, demonstrating his willingness to fight even harder. He looked threateningly in the direction of his opponents and told his comrades that if a little girl works so hard, then they all the more should not fail. The man's comrades fully support his opinion. The monsters that escaped from the maze are not going to give up so easily. Anger and thirst for human blood are still burning on their faces. One is angrier than the other. The battle continues. People are fighting against the monsters of the maze, and they, in turn, are trying to break further into the city in order to take the lives of as many innocent people and civilians as possible. Suddenly, from the other side of the city, a rather large crowd of people is approaching the place of the clash of monsters and people, carrying supplies and trying to evacuate the city. At the head of this crowd is the bell ringer, who announced the beginning of the monster attack. When they get to the central square, he sees an incredible picture in front of him. This can be understood by the surprised and frightened face of the bell ringer. He had never expected to see such a thing. There is a fierce struggle between people and monsters in the square. Goblins bit people and covered them from head to toe. The townspeople who came running were completely shocked by what they saw. One of them even shouted out such an obvious phrase that there is an army of monsters here too. After what they saw, the crowd of citizens decided to change their evacuation direction. They rushed as fast as they could from the place where hordes of monsters were attacking innocent people. Running away from that place, there was intense fear and horror on people's faces. At one point, a crowd of citizens ran to the place where Clarissa's companions were fighting. The man with the mustache heard screams behind him that there were monsters there too, as well as cries for help. Then the man told his comrades that he would stay here and continue to repel the attack of the monsters from the maze, and they should go towards the screams and help there. At these words, his face was full of seriousness. At this time, no less heated things were happening in the place where the man directed his comrades. The bell ringer, who raised the alarm and organized the evacuation of residents, did not know what to do next. At one particular moment, he firmly planted his feet on the ground, trying to resist both his fear of danger and the pressure of monsters that surrounded both the man and his comrades from all sides. Then the bell ringer belligerently punched himself in the chest and threw a battle cry. His face is full of belligerence and determination. He's not going to just give up the city he cares so much about to monsters. He loudly tells his comrades that they have no other choice but to defend themselves and stand to the end in order to survive themselves and secure their city. The action shifts to the girl Clarissa, who still continues to treat the wounded. Somewhere not far from her, there are screams that monsters should not be allowed closer and that help is already coming. Clarissa, on the other hand, is concentrating on another wounded man who is being treated by her. Suddenly, from the side, the girl hears someone pronounce her name. She immediately looks away, looking for the source of the sound. Her eyes carefully scan the space around her. It turned out to be the girl's parents. Clarissa recognized them as soon as she saw them. Her father was injured. This could be understood by the fact that Clarissa's mother was leading him by the arm. The girl immediately rushed to her parents. She came even closer to her father, saying that he should wait a little and she would heal him. The girl's face is full of fear for her father and worry about him. She wants to start treating him immediately. But her father calmly stops her, gently touching her hand. The man then says that Clarissa should continue to treat the adventurers. But despite the fact that he says such words, sweat flows down his face, and it is clear that it is very difficult for a man. At this very moment, the girl begins to be surrounded by wounded and distraught adventurers and just residents of the city. Each of them demands to be cured first. Some even put pressure on the girl by saying that their injuries are more serious than others, so they are the ones she should heal first. Others even stoop to imitating pain to some extent. The crowd of patients gathered around Clarissa is getting bigger and bigger. Each of them pulls the blanket over himself, refusing to wait. People push and send each other to make sure that they are cured first. Suddenly, amid the general noise, someone's voice is heard ordering everyone to disperse and let them pass. All people immediately notice a small man dressed in premium and very expensive clothes. This man turned out to be from a family of aristocrats. He looked arrogantly at Clarissa and firmly said that the aristocrats should be treated first. There was not a drop of doubt in his voice about his words. Then the man came closer to Clarissa and, rolling up the sleeve of his smart suit, showed his small abrasion on his elbow. Then, in a commanding tone, he told the girl to cure him as soon as possible. Clarissa, not expecting such arrogance, and also surprised that an aristocrat considers such a small abrasion to be a serious injury, stared blankly at the man's elbow. Then she calmly told the aristocrat that he only had a bruise on his elbow. The same man looked at the girl uncomprehendingly and extremely seriously, not understanding what the problem was. Clarissa decided to take her leave and say that she would heal the man's elbow a little later, because she did not think that his injury was serious enough to treat him right now, when there were a lot of more seriously injured people around. At the same time, she clarified that it is more important for her now to cure adventurers who are able to fight back against the monsters from the labyrinth that attacked their hometown and beloved city. At the moment of these words, an awkward and polite smile shone on her face. But the aristocrat did not like this answer of the girl, so he gave her a ringing slap in the face, considering that she did not show him due respect as an aristocrat. From the blow, the girl's head turned to the side. Her face reflected a lack of understanding of why she was slapped in the face. The girl's parents, having seen this picture, were completely shocked. They did not expect that a man from high society would dare to hit their daughter for refusing to treat his bruise. The rest of the townspeople also arrived in complete shock from what was happening. No one expected such cruelty from an aristocrat, and in such a situation related to the attack of monsters on the city. The girl, holding her cheek, which was reddened from the blow, continued to stare uncomprehendingly and even in confusion at the man who hit her for almost nothing. Besides, it didn't seem enough to slap Clarissa, and he continued to yell at the girl, asking if it was a joke. Then the aristocrat swings at the girl, intending to hit her. He shouts that Clarissa should be executed for daring to mock him. The aristocrat's sword is approaching the girl, and she is slowly awaiting her fate. Clarissa is already prepared to be struck by the man's sword, but nothing happens. Then the girl decides to open her eyes. The girl realizes that she is being hugged tightly and at the same time protected by her parents. At this moment, her eyes widen in surprise, because she did not expect this at all. The aristocrat also stands in complete misunderstanding of what is happening. Suddenly, Clarissa screams because an aristocrat has done something to her dad. She understands this from his face, which is distorted by the indescribable pain that the man experienced. There is still an aristocrat behind the family. He is outraged at how the girl's parents could have prevented him from punishing Clarissa for the audacity that, in his opinion, she showed. There is a huge and deep wound on the back of the girl's father, which was left to him by the sword of an aristocrat. Despite the pain, Clarissa's father turns to the man and asks him to forgive his daughter. You can tell by the man's face how hard every move is given to him. But this does not stop him, and, overcoming himself, he again turns to the aristocrat with a request to forgive his daughter. Clarissa and her mother immediately rush to the weakened man, who is no longer able to get up on his own. The girl immediately begins to treat her father, trying to make his back wound heal as soon as possible. Her mother is sitting next to her, crying, and not knowing how she can help in this situation. The girl continues to direct the flow of magic to her father's wound, and it gradually begins to heal. But suddenly, the regeneration on her father's back begins to slow down. 1E5. The girl realizes that she is not able to do anything right now because she has run out of mana, which is so necessary at the moment. The realization of this brings tears to the girl's eyes. The aristocrat does not care that Clarissa's father may lose his life right in front of his daughter. The man is more concerned about his injured honor, so he swings his sword again and says that the punishment for the family will be the death penalty. The aristocrat is about to take the lives of a mother and daughter. He begins to lower his sword in their direction. At the same time, he orders to leave this mortal world and repent. It seemed that no one would help Clarissa's poor family anymore, and that she was finished, because all her comrades were too busy fighting monsters that had escaped from the maze, and they could not see what was happening to Clarissa now. The crowd of citizens gathered around them can't do anything about it either. Someone is afraid of the high title of this aristocrat, and someone is too badly injured to resist him. As a result, mother and daughter are left to fend for themselves, as the aristocrat is determined to take their lives. But suddenly he hears some strange sounds. He can't figure out where they're coming from. Suddenly he notices something, and his expression changes a lot. The strongest shock is expressed on the face. At that moment, someone grabbed Aristocrates by the chin and pulled him up with great force. The force was so great that the man's face was distorted by a grimace of pain. That someone turned out to be Mars. He easily pushed the evil aristocrat away from the mother and daughter and the unconscious father. The aristocrat flew quite far up. Clarissa and her mother looked at the hero in surprise, not understanding how such a small boy could throw away an adult man, even though he was not some huge height. During this action, Mars's face was focused and full of seriousness. There was also contempt on his face for the aristocrat and what he wanted to do to this poor family. Clarissa, her mother, and the rest of the townspeople continued to stare at Mars in surprise. There was still no limit to their surprise. No one expected anyone to come to their aid. Then Mars went to the side of Clarissa and her mother, as well as her father, who was lying unconscious. The aristocrat beaten by the young man was lying not far from them, also unconscious, like the girl's father. Mars walked over to the wounded man and picked up the sword lying next to him. He then places his hand on Clarissa's father's forehead and casts a healing spell. During this action, the man winces, feeling the effect of the spell. Then Clarissa's father falls asleep peacefully, and Mars looks at the sleeping man with a grin while holding a sword in his hand, which he picked up next to the man. Then he turns his attention back to the unconscious aristocrat lying nearby, whom the young man had recently sent flying. Then Mars, holding a sword in his hands, says that now it's time to deal with the goblins, and then completely clarify the situation with the aristocrat. At this moment, the excitement of the upcoming battle begins to sparkle in Mars's eyes. Battles with monsters from the maze continue to take place on the streets of the city. Every street was covered with combatants. The number of wounded continued to grow. The panic on the streets of the city did not even think to stop. But suddenly, there was silence everywhere. All the townspeople stared in surprise at the picture that appeared before their eyes. Their faces were full of shock and bewilderment. They couldn't understand what was happening in front of their eyes right now. Clarissa's companions also arrived in utter shock. Their faces also showed a lack of understanding of what was happening right in front of their eyes. The man with the mustache even dropped his jaw in surprise. He was so surprised. Clarissa, on the other hand, was mesmerized by what was happening and admired the boy who arrived so on time and sent an aristocrat into unconsciousness who wanted to execute her entire family. But that wasn't exactly what the girl admired. She was surprised that Mars, completely alone, was able to defeat all the goblins without much effort with just a sword. A whole bunch of lifeless bodies of monsters from the maze appeared behind the young man. He himself, having finished dealing with the monsters that attacked the city, stood proudly inspecting the area and the locals. Not a single muscle moved on his face, either when disarming an aristocrat or when dealing with the monsters of the labyrinth. Suddenly, Mars heard screams behind him. They were full of gratitude and reverence for him. The hero felt rather awkward from such expressed thanks. At some point, he began to look at the crowd of citizens in confusion. Suddenly, the sounds of horses' hooves pounding on the ground were heard. Horsemen were approaching the scene. At the head of the formation rode a rider on a snow-white horse, as befits a squad leader. The knights were getting closer and closer to the scene. The hoof sounds grew louder and louder. The leader of the squad had rather long hair that fluttered in the wind, as did the tails of the horses. The townspeople greeted the squad of knights, approaching them with cheers. The rider rode among slightly ruined buildings, but at the same time they seemed to the locals to be a saving ray of light in the current situation in which they found themselves. The hero was suddenly grabbed by the hand and persistently began to pull aside. The grappler's hand was small and fragile, so her grip strength was small. But this had no effect on how persistently the hand pulled the hero in its direction. The owner of this hand turned out to be none other than Clarissa. She looked sternly at the hero and said that there was one more thing that needed to be done, so Mars should go with her. The young man looked at the girl in surprise, not understanding what she wanted. By this time, a squad of knights had already rode up to the crowd. Their leaders, having strictly examined all those gathered, began to ask everyone about the situation and how many injured people there were after the attack of the labyrinth monsters. At that moment, an aristocrat woke up from the realm of dreams, who wanted to execute first Clarissa, and then her entire family for refusing to treat his bruise on his elbow. Immediately after his prompting, he turned to Count Beetle, the leader of the knights. The man immediately began to show the Count his bruise on his elbow, calling it an injury, then began to say that he had been attacked and that he had been wounded. As a result, he asked the Count to tell him to be cured first. To this, the Count only replied that the bruise of an aristocrat could be postponed for the last time and that, first of all, it was worth treating seriously injured adventurers and ordinary citizens. The aristocrat looked at the Count in utter bewilderment. Then the man furiously began to resent and shout that he was an aristocrat, and that was why he should be treated first. There was so much indignation and misunderstanding on the man's face, as if he had been compared to garbage. To all his indignation, Count Beetle replied that barren ladies should immediately be silenced. The Count's face at that moment showed complete disgust for the interlocutor. At the same time, the man's face showed rage that barren ladies dared to use his position for such selfish purposes. The Baron, hearing such a tone from the Count, was taken aback and fell into complete shock. He never expected to be yelled at, much less ordered to shut up. Up to this point, he had reveled in his position, and no one dared to say a word against him. Then a strong irritation appeared on the Baron's face. and he began to say that all this was because of someone who was able to shake his position in society and in the eyes of citizens. At such moments, barren ladies resembled a small child. Then the action is transferred to the already quiet streets of the city. Everything is quiet and peaceful everywhere. The lifeless bodies of the monsters from the maze had already been removed. The sun was shining brightly outside. All the bad things were already over. Mars was thanked. It was Clarissa herself and her family. They bowed their heads slightly in gratitude for their help in such a difficult situation. Mars replied that they had nothing to thank him for, since he hadn't done anything special. Clarissa's father looked at the hero, smiling, and saying that the young man still surprised them very much by the fact that, despite his small age, he was already so strong. Clarissa, looking at Mars, thinks that he is the same age as her, but at the same time, he is very different in strength. Then she begins to look closely at the hero's face. There is thoughtfulness and suspicion in her face at the same time. There is something confusing about the appearance and power of Mars. Then she decides to take a step towards the hero. And at that moment, a thought runs through her head, so strange and incomprehensible, but in a sense obvious. She's not sure if that's the right idea. Then the girl, after taking a step towards the hero, thanks him for his help once again. At this moment, her face expresses seriousness, but at the same time, sincere gratitude and even some humility. But suddenly the girl says thank you for the third time, and this time sincerely and happily smiles, while awkwardly pressing her small and fragile hand to her chest. There really is genuine sincerity coming from the girl. Hearing these words, the hero freezes in surprise, because the language in which the girl says words of gratitude is Japanese. The hero is both surprised and alarmed. He never expected to hear his native language in this world. He remembers his past and thinks that his girlfriend, who died in that world, in that distant past, just like him, could his dear friend also be reborn in this world? Thinking about such a possibility and probability, the hero first shows surprise and bewilderment on his face, since the probability that this could really happen seemed very small to him. But then a happy smile appears on the hero's face. Then Mars looks at Clarissa with eyes full of happiness and relief, and says that he is so glad about it. The young man did not think that this could be a reality, so there was no limit to his happiness at that moment. Then he takes slow steps towards Clarissa. He has no control over his actions and his legs. The girl also goes to meet the hero, not at all afraid to show him her true feelings. As a result, Mars and Clarissa hug and look at each other with loving eyes. There is a complete understanding between them. From the outside, they look like a couple in love who have not seen each other for many years. Then the hero decides to introduce himself by his name from a previous life. He says that his name is Fujisaki Yuto and that he was 20 years old in a previous life. In this world, his name is Mars Bryant, and he is 7 years old. Clarissa says that in her previous life, her name was Aoi Ayanokoji. She was also 20 years old, but now she is 7 years old in this world and her name is Clarissa. Clarissa's parents look at this picture, and from the word they do not understand at all what is happening here, and from what moment a spark managed to slip between the characters. A man and a woman look at the children in absolute incomprehension. Mars notices this relatively in time, and immediately pulls away from Clarissa so as not to further shock his parents. But they continue to stand in a stone stupor. They still don't understand at what point the two manage to become friends. Clarissa, on the other hand, does not understand at all why Mars pulled away from her. The girl completely forgot that, in addition to the two of them, her current parents are present on the street, who arrive in complete confusion from this picture. Then the hero asks them for forgiveness, and says that he was just a little surprised and that his name is Mars. Clarissa's father says that he understands everything, and then he also introduces himself, saying that his name is Grey Rampart. His wife says that her name is Erina, and the girl introduces herself to the hero again, saying that her name is Clarissa. Grey Rampart then asks Mars if he has a free minute, which breaks the awkward silence after the introduction of each of those present. The hero, of course, has a free minute. Then the action moves to Clarissa's house. The one on the outside looked pretty neat and even beautiful. There, Clarissa's family learns that Mars has arrived in their city from the kingdom of Barkis. Clarissa's father then explains that Mars is now located in the labyrinth city of Grantham, which is located in the east of the kingdom of Zarkum. Then the man asks how the hero got here. He explains that he and his brother Ike explored the maze from which the monsters later escaped. The action is transferred to Mars's memories of how he and his brother were in the maze. The hero recalls that in one of the rooms he found a wall from which magical power emanated. Sensing this, he informed Ike about it. Then the brothers decided to explore it, due to the fact that magical power emanated from it. Mars managed to get his hand inside the stone wall and feel something among the stones. It was pretty amazing that he was able to do it. During the penetration into the wall, Mars felt that his hand began to suck in, and therefore he could not pull it out of the wall. Then the hero decided to try to just go inside the wall. He informed his brother of his decision. Mars also told Ike that he would have a crystal with him, by which the young man would be able to determine his location. In confirmation of his words, the hero demonstrated to his brother the presence of such a stone. But Ike's face didn't get any less wary. Then Mars began to sink deeper and deeper into the wall. During this process, he asked his brother to pick him up as soon as possible. At the time of these words, the hero had an awkward, embarrassed, and slightly frightened smile on his face. He was sinking deeper and deeper. Then he also told the simultaneously confused and angry Ike not to forget to report the incident to his father. The same one continued to stare rather angrily at his brother, who continued to plunge into the unknown. As a result, when the hero was pulled out of the wall to the other side, he found himself in the city of the labyrinth. At that moment, there was no limit to his surprise. There was no way he could have expected to end up here. But he found himself not in the city itself, but near it on a small ledge of rock. The action returns to Clarissa's house. Her parents listened attentively to the hero's story and were very surprised by this turn of events. They did not expect Mars to be in their city in such an unusual way. Clarissa's father then says that their kingdoms are at war. At the moment of pronouncing these words, Clarissa's father's face becomes extremely serious. He doesn't really want to get this information out of his memory. Then a friendly smile appears on his face again, and he offers Mars to stay with them for the time being. His wife, standing next to him, nods in agreement. These people don't mind at all seeing guests in their house, and especially Mars, who saved their family from execution. Then Clarissa's mother joins the conversation. She tells Mars that they are ready to show their hospitality to him. A kind and sincere smile shines on her face. She's definitely not against the hero staying. The hero bows his head in gratitude and thanks the owners of the house for their hospitality, saying that it would be very useful since he found himself all alone in a new city, where he now has only Clarissa's family among his acquaintances. Suddenly, Clarissa also speaks up. She turns to her father. In her voice, even when pronouncing the word dad, there is a request. Already here you can understand that the girl wants to ask her father for something. As a result, the girl asked her father for permission to talk to Mars alone. Clarissa had a radiant smile on her face during this request. It was obvious that this conversation with the hero was very important to her. Mars, having heard her request, sat opposite with the happiest face possible due to the fact that Clarissa was able to remember his new name. Besides the fact that his face looked as happy as possible, he also blushed either from embarrassment or joy. The father turned to his daughter with a good-natured smile and agreed to her request. The man had no idea what Clarissa wanted to talk to Mars about. It seemed to him that this conversation would be similar to the communication of two 7-year-old children. But when Clarissa spoke again, a question and a slight misunderstanding appeared on the man's face, because the intonation of his daughter's voice had become too conspiratorial. As a result, he became wary. Then Clarissa dragged Mars to her room for a private conversation, which greatly confused and surprised Mars himself and his father, who had a timely question about why they could not talk here in the kitchen. The action shifts to Clarissa's room. It's not very big, but it's not very small either. The girl's clothes are neatly hanging on the hanger. Her costume is mostly well ironed and hangs separately from the rest of her clothes. The characters are sitting on the bed, and Clarissa asks Mars what he saw then. A girl and a girl are sitting very close to each other on Clarissa's small bed. At the head of the bed is the hero's sword, propped against the wall. Then the characters look at each other, and Mars begins his story about what he saw after losing his life. The girl listens attentively to his story with the most serious expression on her pretty little face. The hero tells about his meeting with the demigod and how he sent him to this world as a rebirth, and also that the demigod cast a spell on the three of them, which is why it all happened. After listening to the hero, Clarissa concludes that the robber who took their lives has also been reborn, so it's better for them not to speak Japanese in public. Suddenly, the characters hear a strange sound coming from the street. This sound is quite alarming to them. The heroes immediately start running to the window. Looking out the window, Clarissa and Mars see a small group of soldiers dressed in armor walking through the streets of the city to a certain place. The hero suggests that the goblins have attacked the city again. Suddenly, the girl takes Mars by the hand and starts pulling him away from the window. The hero looks at Clarissa uncomprehendingly. Her face expresses the utmost seriousness, and even to some extent sadness. The hero understands what such an expression on her face means. At first he is surprised and confused, not knowing what to say. But then a good-natured and reassuring smile appears on his face. He turns to the girl with the words that he will go to their aid. The girl raises her head sharply upon hearing these words. She doesn't want to let go of the hero. Then surprise and shock appear on her face. Clarissa begins to shout at the hero that he is from a hostile country, and as a result, he may be taken into custody at best, and at worst, executed. At these words, Mars straightens his shoulders and says that people are the same everywhere. Confidence in the correctness of his actions shines in his eyes. Then he looks at the girl and says that he will protect everyone, including Clarissa. Upon hearing these words, the girl begins to feel embarrassed and looks at the hero in surprise. She hadn't expected to hear such words from him at all. Then Clarissa rushes to the hero and hugs him tightly. The hero retreats slightly in surprise and then hugs the girl in response. Clarissa, clinging tightly to the hero, warmly thanks him for his courage and willingness to help. At the moment when the hero leaves Clarissa's room with a sword on one shoulder, the girl's parents have already approached the door of the room. They look at the young man in surprise. Then Clarissa's father says, "It looks like the goblins have shown up again." He continues to stare at Mars in surprise. The hero, with a smile on his face, replies that he will go to the rescue of the soldiers of the Labyrinth City and help deal with the goblins. The girl's father looks worriedly at Mars and asks if he is sure of his decision. He worries about what will happen if they find out that the hero came from a hostile state. Then he tells the already departing hero that in such a situation they will not be able to protect him. There is still concern in the man's voice. To this, Mars only replies that he is ready for this. At the moment of these words, a friendly and calm smile flashes on his face. Then the hero leaves Clarissa's house and prepares to go to the scene of the accident. To do this, he puts the sword blade forward and stands in a stance. Then he starts running with the speed of the wind into the thick of things. He rushes along a completely empty street. At a certain point, he runs to the place where the Count and Boron are and are talking about something. When he starts approaching them, he asks them for forgiveness. Then the young man with a big and bright smile asks the aristocrats if he can join them in the battle against the goblins. The Baron immediately recognizes the hero and shouts to the whole street that he is the damn thief. The Count watches this situation with incomprehension in his eyes. The Count asks the hero if he stole the sword of dams. Mars looks at the sword in his hands in surprise. Then the Count says that he will deal with the theft later, and now he asks the hero to leave and not interfere. At the moment of these words, the Count is as serious as possible. Suddenly, a soldier dressed from head to toe in armor approaches the Count from behind. He tells the Count not to jump to conclusions, since this boy alone was able to defeat all the goblins. When the hero heard that the soldier knew about what he had done recently, he smiled rather, and the Count was completely shocked by what he heard. Then the Count decided to ask the hero to lend them his power to fight the goblins. To this, Mars replies that he was going to do just that, and that he was not going to miss the opportunity to help the city. Suddenly, a stone with great force flies into a soldier standing behind a man with blonde hair, dressed in armor, and he falls to the ground unconscious. The leader of the knights notices this, and irritation appears on his face. He realizes that right now he has lost another person. He starts to think that this is the end now. The man is the commander of the Blair Knights. He is in complete despair. A man kneels in front of a horde of goblins and thinks that if he retreats now, the locals will suffer. Inspired, the knight commander finds the strength to stand up and rises from his knees. His legs are shaking quite a lot. Then the knight raises his sword and points it towards the monsters. He thinks to himself that he is ready to lose his life here, but he will stop them. At this very moment, a huge goblin approaches the brave knight and prepares to smear the man. The monster has already swung at the knight and continues to look at the goblin with complete incomprehension of what is happening. At the moment of realization, despair appears on the soldier's face. But at this moment, at the level of the goblin's neck, something is rushing at an incredible speed. At the same moment, the monster grabs his throat and his companions start staring at him in surprise. Then, a huge monster begins to fall directly on their relatives, which causes them no small surprise. The commander of the knights looks at this picture with unprecedented surprise. Mars deals with the remaining goblins, while the knight commander admires his technique. After completing the massacre of the goblins, the hero turns to the leader of the knights and says that the goblins are finished and that he can be calm. He still looks at the hero in surprise and dumbfounded says thank you to Mars, as well as the surviving soldiers. To this, Mars only tells them to return, as the Count is waiting for them. As a result, the hero leads a squad of knights who chant the phrase, "Long live the swordsman." The Count greets the hero with a smile and says that the city was saved thanks to him. He also says that they will deal with Baron Dams later, since the most important thing now is to discuss his reward. The hero looks at the Count with a smile on his face and completely agrees with him. The hero has nothing against it at all. The action is transferred to the Adventurers Guild. A man with a bald head, but with a rather bushy mustache, says thank you to Mars on behalf of the whole city and also introduces himself as a local guild master. Then the guild master asks what the hero's name is. The young man replies that his name is Mars. Then the hero tells the man that he has a question. He wonders what kind of question it is. The boy decides to ask if there is a way to stop the saturation of the maze. The Count and the guild master look at the hero dumbfounded. The guild master replies that the saturation of the maze can only be stopped by conquering it. The boy also asks another question about when he will be fed. The man replies that their country is currently at war, and therefore they do not have enough hands. It is because of this problem that the conquest of the labyrinth is not progressing at all. The hero says that he understood them. At this point, his voice sounds rather thoughtful and slightly detached. Mars then says that, in this case, he will conquer the maze himself. During these words, his voice is extremely serious. From such a statement, the Count and the Guildmaster fell into complete shock. All the shock they had fallen into could be read on their faces. Then the Guildmaster starts talking about how even a group of 4 adventurers from the rank did not return from there. The Count asks the hero a question about whether he will go there all alone. Then he says it's very dangerous. At the moment of this conversation, Clarissa bursts into the room, shouting that in this case the hero can take her with him. Everyone starts to look in the direction of the uninvited guest in surprise. The hero, dumbfounded, pronounces the girl's name. The guildmaster asks the girl in surprise if she really wants to go to the maze with the hero. The man says that although he possesses holy magic, it is still too dangerous. The girl looks at the man seriously and says that leaving everything as it is even more dangerous. Therefore, she will go with Mars, because then there will be more chances of success. As a result, the hero turns to the head of the guild with a request to let Clarissa go with him. The man is absolutely not happy with such a request. But then the Count intervenes. He says that since the situation is an emergency, he will do everything possible to support them. The Count then asks the hero what he wants as a reward. The hero replies that he wants the Count to promise him the protection of the Rampod family. Mars thinks to himself that he and Clarissa have explained what problems they had with that nobleman. At the hero's request, the Count replied that he guarantees the safety of the Rampod family. The hero thanks the Count for the service rendered. Night is slowly falling on the city. The guildmaster says Mars and Clarissa are amazing kids. The Count agrees with him. The Count then asks the guildmaster to ask Mars to register as an adventurer. Guildmaster Victor agrees. The action shifts to Clarissa's house. The heroes are met by the girl's parents. The heroes tell them the news that they are going to go to the maze. The girl's parents agree and forgive Mars to keep an eye on their daughter. The heroes go to bed. Mars thinks that he wants to return home as soon as possible, so he needs to conquer the maze, but he will worry about this city and about Clarissa if he leaves. The hero recalls a conversation with the demigod before his rebirth. Mars then thinks that he must make Clarissa stronger, because if she gets stronger, she will be able to conquer the maze and achieve a lot in the future. The action is postponed to the next day. The heroes are going on the road and arming themselves for a rather long and difficult journey. Suddenly, the hero turns to Clarissa and says that before punishing the maze, she must become stronger. The girl agrees. The hero then decides to evaluate Clarissa's abilities with his magic using the Heavenly Eye spell. As a result, the heroes found out that Clarissa has a talent for barrier magic. The girl couldn't believe it. Clarissa then asked the hero how she could use it. Mars replied that, unfortunately, he did not know that. The girl, hearing this, was slightly upset. Mars suggested that we start with what we can definitely do now. The hero then mentioned that he is not a swordsman at all, but a magician who uses wind magic as well as holy magic. His abilities aroused the girl's admiration. After seeing all the abilities of Mars, the girl got stars in her eyes from the huge amount of admiration for the hero. Then Mars decided to ask Clarissa how she thinks a person can become stronger. The girl suggested that he could become stronger through hard work. The hero says that hard work is very important, but the right answer is practice. As a result, Mars brought the girl to the dungeon and asked her to first defeat one small and relatively weak goblin. The girl, realizing what Mars wanted from her, got into a slight stupor. A huge number of questions began to spin in her head. She didn't know how to do it, the sword seemed heavy to her, she doubted if she could handle it. At one point, the question popped into her head, would she be able to defeat this monster? Fear appeared in her eyes. Suddenly, the goblin went on the attack. The girl heard the voice of the hero, who shouted at her not to sleep. At one point, the goblin almost hurt the girl, but a powerful stream of air arrived in time, which threw the monster away from Clarissa. Mars approached the girl and asked if she was all right. Clarissa replied that she was fine. Suddenly, the hero noticed that the girl's whole body was shaking. Seeing this, the hero asked Clarissa if she would change her mind and he would go alone. The girl lowered her head shyly. Then she starts talking about how when that nobleman wanted to take her father's life, she couldn't do anything. She says that even if it is difficult for her, she wants to become stronger so that she can protect her family. She then asks Mars to give her another fight with the goblin. The hero smiles and says that he hopes that the girl will become stronger. The hero once again conducts Clarissa a training battle with a weak goblin from the maze. Mars tells the girl to get used to the weight of the sword. Clarissa obediently fulfills all the requirements of the hero. The girl mentally encourages herself, saying that she can do anything. She gets over her fear of defeat. At this moment, she is ready to attack the goblin. The girl, holding her sword high, rushes at the maze monster. He is also not going to just wait for her, and also rushes to attack the girl. Then, approaching the right distance, she lowers her sword, trying to hit the goblin directly. Clarissa has calculated exactly how, where, and when she needs to hit the goblin to get the better of him. The girl manages to carry out her plan, and she dissects the goblin's chest. She put all the strength that was in her delicate hands into this blow. The monster screams in pain, and the girl watches it with the most serious look. As a result, the goblin's lifeless body was lying at the girl's feet. The monster was defeated. At that moment, Mars ran up to Clarissa with joyful shouts and said that she had done a great job. There was no limit to the young man's joy. Suddenly, the girl's legs gave way, and she fell to her knees on the cold stone floor of the maze with a sword in her hands, looking absolutely sad and devastated. There was a rather confused aura coming from the girl. The hero did not understand why the girl looked so upset and devastated. But the girl was not upset at all. She looked at the hero with a smile and said that it was as if a mountain had been lifted from her shoulders. Clarissa then participated in bigger and bigger battles with the monsters of the maze and, as a result, became stronger and stronger. She practiced every day until she could hold the sword tightly. Then the girl began to collect better equipment for herself in order to go conquer the maze. Little by little, Clarissa became stronger and stronger. The characters leave the clinic where Clarissa works. On the way home, the characters talk about the fact that recently people have been coming to Clarissa's clinic even from other cities. The girl says that now there are many more people she doesn't know. Suddenly, the hero is visited by some strange feeling that strains him quite a lot. It seems to him that someone is watching them. He turns around abruptly and begins to explore the surrounding area. Clarissa is very surprised by the behavior of Mars, and therefore she is interested in why the hero behaves like this. Mars says that everything is fine and asks the girl not to pay attention to it. The hero assumes that he just imagined it. Then Clarissa, with a very joyful and happy look, suggests that the hero go to a restaurant today because they need to eat meat to recover from a hard day. The hero agrees. There is a man hiding behind the house who was watching Mars and Clarissa. He really didn't want to be discovered, so when he realized that Mars had noticed something, the man immediately hid behind the house. The person's face looks very serious and slightly irritated. The next day comes. The sky is pretty clear, and the sun is shining very brightly. The heroes go back to the maze so that Clarissa can practice again, but with a stronger opponent to improve her skills. Mars says that now Clarissa should have the strength to beat the goblin general alone. The girl against the background of this giant seems very tiny, and at first glance it may seem that she will not be able to defeat this monster. The girl immediately remembers that you need to keep your distance from large opponents, so immediately increases it between yourself and the monster as quickly as possible, so as not to give the enemy a head start and time to attack her first. Having reached the desired distance, Clarissa prepares to attack the enemy. At the moment when the goblin begins to approach her, the girl loads the bow and prepares to attack him, having already decided by that time on which points she will beat the monster. Then she turns to her opponent and decides to blind him with an arrow fired from a bow. Her aim was quite accurate, as she had already learned how to handle a bow and arrow during her training. The arrow hit right on target, piercing the monster's left eye. The monster howled from the indescribable pain that such a fragile girl could inflict on him. Then the girl decided to make the goblin general lose his balance with another arrow. Clarissa fired an arrow straight into the monster's leg, then into the shoulder joint, and then into the hand. Thus, the girl managed to bring the huge monster off balance. Then the girl decided to shoot the last arrow at the most vulnerable place, due to which she would have knocked down the goblin general with 100% probability. This vulnerable spot turned out to be the monster's head. Clarissa's arrow flew exactly on target, sending the goblin general into the peaceful realm of dreams. All the time that Clarissa was fighting against the goblin general, Mars was watching the girl, analyzing her every move. He was very happy about her victory over the goblin. Then Clarissa realized that she was still able to whitewash such a strong opponent on her own. There was no limit to her happiness. There was a winning smile on the girl's face. Then the heroes go to celebrate Clarissa's victory over the goblin general. The girl is just beside herself with happiness. Mars says he knew Clarissa would make it, and he wholeheartedly congratulates her on defeating the goblin. The girl says that, thanks to the hero, she has become stronger, and thanks Mars for this. The hero responds in kind. He then suggests that she return home and rest. She agrees, and they go home. There they eat very tasty sandwiches. Clarissa devours them with great appetite. The hero wonders if Clarissa is very hungry. The girl replies that she has spent a lot of energy, that's why she is hungry. The hero nods understandingly, and then he looks at Clarissa as if mesmerized. He thinks that tomorrow they will move into the maze, and therefore these fun days will come to an end. Suddenly, the girl notices the hero's gaze and asks why he is looking at her like that. She is slightly embarrassed by such a look. Mars replies that he was just thinking a little, and then turns the conversation back to the great taste of sandwiches. The day of exploring the maze is coming. The heroes thank the Count for coming to escort them to the entrance to the maze. Suddenly, the hero is visited again by that strange feeling of surveillance. Mars abruptly raises his head up to check the area around them. He then turns to the Count to ask if he feels they are being followed. Then the hero adds that the first time such a feeling visited him for a long time, but today it is especially strong. To this, the Count replies that he has already taken care of this problem, and Mars needs to focus on conquering the maze. The hero agrees with the Count, but thinks to himself that something seems to be happening. But now he makes conquering the maze a priority for himself. Then a squad of knights, along with the heroes and the Count, enters the maze. There begins a fierce battle of people against the monsters of the maze. The Count gives the order to his men to attack the monsters, sparing no effort. Then he turns to Mars and says that he and his people will stay here, and he leaves everything else to the heroes. Mars agrees, and he and Clarissa hit the road. The further they move through the maze, the more ferocious monsters they encounter on the way. But the heroes are not afraid of difficulties, and they easily overcome them. As a result, when they get to the boss's room, most of the monsters have turned into a pile of lifeless bodies. Mars asks the boss to leave it to him, and Clarissa agrees. Then they enter the boss's room. He sits quite calmly on the throne, thinking that some boy does not pose any threat to him. Then the hero begins to act against the goblin boss, namely, their king. The monster accepts the challenge of Mars and even rises from the throne. Clarissa watches with a clear degree of concern as Mars is about to take the fight from the Goblin King. She thinks that this boss is much higher level than the goblins they have met. The Goblin King is starting to approach. But Mars decides to cause a tornado and directs it towards the Goblin King, who is immediately taken out of the battle, so Mars comes out victorious. Clarissa stands completely shocked at how easily the hero dealt with the Goblin King. The hero says that they have conquered the maze. Now they can return back to the city. The action is transferred to the manor of Barnum Damsa. He sits in his magnificent and luxurious armchair and thinks that his plan is just perfect and therefore Count Beetle will be finished. The Baron thinks that with his own money he has hired 200 mercenaries who will easily deal with Count Beetle's knights, and thus Baron Dames plans to stage a coup. Sitting in his chair, the Baron laughs loudly and says that he will become the ruler of this city. Suddenly, he hears a knock on the door and wonders if they have already come with a report on Count Beetle. He opens the door and loudly asks if the knights were killed. Then his face turns pale abruptly, and the Baron himself is speechless. In front of him stands none other than Count Beetle himself. The man perfectly heard the Baron's speech, so you can perfectly understand how angry he is by his face. He stands contemptuously, looking at the Baron, and behind him are his knights, whom Dames ordered to be killed. The action is transferred back to the maze. Mars and Clarissa come out of it. They are met by a guard left by Count Beetle. He thanks the heroes for their work, and then asks how things are going in the maze. To this, Mars replies that they have already finished. The soldier is very surprised by this, and he says that the heroes are simply amazing. Then he says that Count Beetle has already returned home, so he will conduct the heroes himself. Mars nods in agreement. Then the action shifts to the estate of Count Beetle, where the Count himself meets Mars and Clarissa, who are confronted with a very strange picture. Barren ladies tied up, and Clarissa's parents behaved. Count Beetle says that he is very glad that the heroes returned from the maze alive. He then explains that while the heroes were conquering the maze, Baron Dames was trying to stage a coup in the city. The Count says that the man had been buying weapons and hiring mercenaries for a long time, so it was decided to organize surveillance of him. As a result, Count Beetle deprives Baron Dames of the title of Baron and imprisons him for attempting to carry out a coup. Upon hearing this, the former Baron is already terrified. In his toga, he is taken away, and the Count returns to his guests. He wholeheartedly thanks Mars and Clarissa for conquering the maze. The man calls the children the heroes of their country. Clarissa's parents are standing nearby, and they are very happy to hear this. The Count says that thanks to the merit of the children, the Rampart family will be titled. Then the Count turns to Clarissa's father and asks him to give an answer when he decides. The man nods in agreement, saying that he needs to consult with his family first. Then the whole family leaves the Count's office and heads home. Mars is delayed for a short time. His Count asks him to stay with him today. The hero agrees without hesitation. In the evening, he is served a rather rich and hearty dinner at the same table with the Count. At the table, Count Beetle apologizes for what the former Baron ladies did, and the Count's subordinate, also sitting at the table, apologizes to Mars for spying. The hero replies that everything is fine. Then everyone starts to have dinner quietly. Suddenly, the Count starts saying that now they need to get down to business. He addresses Mars, saying that he is from the Marcus Kingdom, a hostile kingdom. The hero is immediately scared because he was discovered. The Count tells him not to worry, because he knows that Mars is not hostile to them. It turned out that Count Beetle tried to register the hero as an adventurer. Then the truth was revealed. Therefore, the hero told about his current situation. The Count, after listening to the hero's story, thought about it and said that it did not look like the hero could be teleported back. Then he says that he will make sure that Mars is brought back. Mars thanks the Count for his generosity. The Count clarifies that the preparation will take about a week, and he will write a letter so that the Kingdom of Marcus understands that it is safe. As a result, Mars is still sent back home. He says goodbye to Count Beetle and Clarissa's family. They all thank him for all the good deeds he has done, to which the hero thanks them in return. He asks Clarissa to take care of herself. The girl just smiles at this. A girl stands on the street and taps her left foot. It shows her excitement. She turns to the couple who were standing behind her and starts talking to them. The heroine tells her mom and dad how grateful she is to them for everything they have done for her. The parents, in turn, are shaking and barely holding back tears. The girl sadly claims that she will go with her dear friend, so she will have to leave her beloved home. There are tears in her eyes, but a smile shines on her face. Clarissa's words cause a huge surprise on the guy's face, which is why his manhole opens wide. He did not expect that she would make such a decision, agreeing to follow him further. The girl rushes into the arms of her parents. Tears are already streaming down their faces, and says that she will be fine. She will return home soon. Then he confidently heads towards the main character. The young man watches all this from the side. His eyes are wide open in surprise. Tears are ready to roll down his cheeks because he is so moved by the scene, but confirms that they can go. Mars, who is already ready to start driving the horses, informs them that they are ready to go. When they move out, the crowd shouts after them to come back to them at least sometimes. The trip with Clarice went smoothly. They saw many sights, ate various delicacies. Everything was fine until the couple got to the new city. Upon arrival, sitting in the tavern of the village where they found themselves, the girl informs that she has a lot of fun traveling. The guy replies that it is even more fun with her. Here, Mars turns to some kind of loud scream. He notices that a breathless, mustachioed man who suddenly ran into the tavern informs him that he has an urgent quest. The outraged stranger continues to impatiently broadcast that he urgently needs to find an escaped slave. He says she ran away to the monster forest and they can't find her there. Visitors begin to wonder if this lost slave was somehow special. Such a question makes a man get annoyed and he bites his lip in excitement. The man, whose clothes were expensive enough for such a modest place, raises his head and, clenching his fists, confidently informs that the lost girl is an elf. A pair of travelers, consisting of a young man and a girl, hear that a stranger is ready to pay 100 gold pieces and imploringly ask someone to take on this task. The main character, smiling, looks at his companion and informs them that it's time for them to pack up and leave. At the next table, he hears a man say that such a high reward is very interesting. The innkeeper continues to argue that they will have to go to the monster forest if they agree to this task, and it is dangerous even for a B-rank group there. A man with a ponytail on his head rises up and says that money is, of course, important, but life is much more important. A man in a fur coat with a black collar looks very upset because no one agreed with his task. The visitors of the inn ask him to forget about the lost slave. The heroes are leaving there at this time. Clarice asks her companion if he has ever seen elves. The young man replies that he's never seen them. The girl says that she has not met them either. The girl looks out through a window located in one of the walls of the carriage. The guy notices that they are now passing near the forest where the elf was lost. In order to make sure that he is right, the main character opens the map, where he sees that, just the same, there is a forest of monsters next to them, which scares the locals very much. Suddenly, a cry is heard from the companion of Mars, who asks him to look carefully ahead. Right in front of the carriage, which rushes through the thicket, a girl with two tails on her head appears. It's like she's running fast from something. This is surprising to the couple. Due to the fact that the carriage is quickly approaching a stranger, the heroes see a face and ears that are not hidden by hair. By these distinctive signs, they will know that there is an elf girl there. The elf is running away from a black snake, which neither the main character nor Clarice have ever seen, because it is simply huge. The young man, who is sitting in the driver's seat, notices that the girl is running towards them, but at the same time, he is afraid that they will hit her with the carriage. The next second, the guy grabs his sword. Picking up his favorite weapon, Mars informs his companion that he will go and deal with the snake, and Clarice instructs to protect the frightened girl. His girlfriend listens to him. Jumping off from his seat outside the carriage, the main character begins to run towards the girl who is in danger. The snake is slowly but surely trying to overtake her. The guy flies up, then strikes the snake. This angers the cold-blooded even more. She turns her muzzle at the young man, and her huge mouth appears in front of the heroes. The young man jumps to the ground, but then bounces off and runs further into the forest in order to take the snake away from the girl running away from her, who, in turn, hurries to the carriage. The main character barely manages to dodge his opponent's deft punches. He covers himself with his edged weapon. Then, Mars starts running away with an expression of huge confusion on his face. The snake, of course, follows him, with a crazy expression in his eyes. The snake shoots venom forward. The young man quickly manages to deviate from it. The next second, the guy, turning back, sees that the substance that the animal spat out melted the wood. The main character does not understand why his wind blade does not work on this monster. The snake begins to gather in rings and look closely at its opponent. The guy swears. Mars uses his ability, which is called the Eye of Heaven, so that he sees all the characteristics of the infernal snake. He realizes that they are higher than the Goblin Kings, so he will have to use stronger skills. The next second, an arrow flies into a huge black snake, which surprises both the animal and the hero fighting it. The guy looks around and sees that Clarice has come to his aid. The girl continues to shoot arrows from her weapon. Her friend warns that the snake is releasing poison from its mouth, so you need to be careful, and then asks to buy time for him, to which the girl agrees. The snake starts attacking Clarice, and there, in turn, tries to escape from her. The main character, sticking his sword into the ground, watches these actions and begs her to hold out a little longer. Mars concentrates, and, invoking his inner magic, causes a small stream of flame in one hand and a small tornado in the other. Such a flow of magic distracts the snake. The cold-blooded animal changes the course of its movement and starts attacking the guy again. He thinks that he needs a little more time, a little more, and he will be able to use his power to the fullest. The snake is already next to him and opens its mouth. The snake is trying to bite through the barrier with its venomous fangs, which suddenly appeared above the young man to protect him while he was casting a spell. The animal manages to do this, but the main character is already ready to attack. The main character moves his hands forward and directs a spell at the monster that sounds like a firestorm. A stream of pure energy, which consists of fire and air, rushes straight at the crazy animal and hits the target. After the spell that saved the travelers' lives and saved them from a huge monster dissipates, Mars finds his fighting girlfriend behind him, who is very surprised by the sight that presented her. A little later, it turns out that the barrier that was erected over the main character was created with the help of the barrier wizard Clarice. The guy claims that thanks to him, his life was saved. The girl, shyly raising her hand to her face, which already had a bright pink blush, says that, of course, it was a desperate step, but she is happy that she succeeded. After the excitement of the battle fades, the young man asks where his companion has put the elf. The girl, in turn, replies that she hid it in the carriage, to which the young man responds with understanding. The couple is heading towards the carriage. As soon as the carriage door swings open, the heroes are confronted by a girl whom they have safely protected from a huge snake-like monster. Clarice asks if the elf is hurt. The girl, who, huddled into a ball, pulling her knees to herself, was sitting near another wall of the transport, trembling and anxiously asking if her rescuers would return her back to the merchant. The elf covers herself with her bruised hands and says with tears in her eyes that she doesn't want to go back there. Her words turn into hysteria. Travelers look at it and say that they are not going to return it. The blonde traveler approaches the girl they saved, which scares her a little, but then the victim asks if what they are saying is true. Clarice reports that they are indeed telling the truth. The elf, feeling joy, rushes into the arms of her new friend, who, paired with her friend, saved her. The young man looks into the carriage and sees that his companion is very surprised by what is happening. Clarice, with a smile on her face, asks what is the name of the girl who was saved by them earlier, who, still burying herself in the girl's chest, answers, "Her name is Misha." The traveler asks to tell the story that happened to Misha. She began to say that the man whom the characters had previously seen at the bar said he would take her to her mother, but later kidnapped her. The elf continues to be in the arms of her new acquaintances and says that she really wants to go back to her mother. The young man, after getting down on one knee in front of the emotional girls, informs them that everything has been decided. The guy attracts his attention, then claims that they will find her mother together, which causes gratitude from the girl. She lifts her tear-stained face up and says that she was just saved, then thanks them again. A couple of the main characters who helped Misha introduce themselves by giving their names. They think that now a goal has been added to their goals in the form of finding Misha's mother. The carriage stops in the middle of the forest, after which the heroes get out of it. The guy, looking at the elf they saved, says that she needs to be washed first because there is dirt and bruises on her body. The young man uses earth magic, after which a structure similar to a small pool begins to grow directly from the soil. Then he uses water magic, filling the pool, then heats the water with fire magic. The main character looks at the result of his labors with satisfaction and, turning to the girls, says that the bath is ready. They really like what they see in front of them. The girls begin to undress. Clarice and the girl who was rescued earlier are sitting relaxed and enjoying the warm water. The young heroine is surprised that she and her rescuers are the same age. The traveler confirms her words and says that this is why they can be addressed freely without resorting to respectful words. He sat in silence for a while, and the adventurer asks Misha a question, asks what kind of person her mother is. The girl replies that her mother is a B-rank adventurer, and she is also very strong and beautiful. After a moment's hesitation, the elf says that, by the way, she didn't have to, but her savior has the same big breasts as her mother. The main character hears all this conversation, who is standing near the building at this time, guarding the perimeter. Misha changes into the clothes that Clarice gives her. She reports that the clothes look pretty cute, although they are a little bigger than she usually wears. But everything is fine. The girl runs up to the main characters and thanks them cordially, after which they get into the carriage and set off on their way, because it will soon begin to get dark. After the travelers have reached the nearest city, they realize that they have reached the destination that Count Beetle asked them to avoid. They look around and realize that there is clearly nothing for children to do there. The main character, walking through the streets and seeing that they are filled with very suspicious people, remembers that their way here lay through a forest of monsters, as well as dangers waiting for them near the city. Suddenly, a one-eyed stranger turns to the guy from the right side, who hands him a sword. He asks if the young man is a knight's apprentice and offers him to buy a sword for 10 gold pieces, saying that it is a masterpiece. The guy says that he does not have any money with him, so he refuses to buy, but the old man asks him not to miss such a chance. After that, Mars begins to run away. The unknown, throwing it over his shoulder, thinks that it is impossible to run away from such luck. The main character comes to one of the establishments where you can get a task. He turns to the makeshift reception desk and says that he would like to take a quest, as well as find out where to spend the night in this city. The man immediately answers him that there are no quests. The young man is informed that the hotel is located across the street. After receiving this information, the guy thanks the woman. All this is being watched by two men who are surprised that the hero is very small for an adventurer. Walking through the streets, the main character realizes that he is being watched. Then he hears someone distracting him by calling him small. He turns around and sees that behind him is the crook who offered to buy him a sword and two strangers. The old man complains that the young man still missed his chance to buy a weapon, to which the guy replies that even after persuasion, he will not buy it and asks for forgiveness. The stranger starts shouting at him, saying that he is not being listened to attentively. With a sixth sense, the guy realizes that someone is approaching him from behind. In order to avoid being caught, the young man makes a high jump, leaving the hands of the enemy. The next second, the guy puts his feet in the face of a man with an eye patch and makes a push, after which he begins to fly over two huge people who tried to grab him and lands behind them. One of the bald men notices that the guy moves quite well, and the second says that he can be sold profitably at auction. Men conclude that you can make a big jackpot by grabbing it. The young man stands in a fighting pose. The main character, clutching his edged weapon tightly in his hands, thinks that he needs to return to his girlfriend as soon as possible. One of the hairless strangers brings a sword to his own neck and begins to swing, saying that the young man does not resist, and then the two girls they found nearby will not be lonely. Mars realizes that we are talking about Clarice and Misha. He throws his sword to the ground and agrees to be captured by them. The guy says he will be obedient, then asks them to let him meet the girls. One of the robbers begins to carry a bag over the young man's head. He says the guy made a great move and praises him. The next second, a bag of cotton falls on the young man's head and shoulders. The two bald men who captured Mars with threats report to Hyde, their ringleader, saying they brought great merchandise. The man with the crazy look says that they did a good job and that the night auction will be great. The boss, sitting at the table in his office, says to take the caught prey to his room. Two huge men obediently obey his orders. Then the guy is led through the corridors to the rooms allocated for him. The main character, opening the door, is pushed into the room. After he gets inside, the door slams behind him, and an order is heard from outside the room that he should not touch his familiar girls with a finger. Both the elf girl and the young man's combat friend are very happy to see him. They jump up from their seats and say their friend's name. He, in turn, asks if they are injured. The girls sit down on the bed again and answer that they are all right, because in the place where they got to, the goods they turned out to be treated well enough. Mars says there's something good about it. Clarice apologizes to her comrade in arms for getting caught so stupidly. The young man replies that there is nothing wrong with that. The next second, the elf grabs the blonde heroine and says that she is very scared. The guy sits down next to the girls and tells them not to worry, because everything will be fine. The young man reports that he deliberately let himself be captured by the robbers in order to save them. Mars says that he will not let them offend. Thanks to this, the tears in the elf's eyes dry up, and hope appears in her gaze. The main character continues to report that as soon as they get out, they will find Misha's mother together, so he asks her to be patient for a while. Joy appears in Misha's eyes, and a healthy blush blooms on her cheeks, as she is very happy with what the young man said and agrees with his words. A few minutes later, two bald men enter the room who are engaged in abductions of heroes and say that it's time for them to go out. The three travelers are led out into the corridor and then told to go ahead. The trio, consisting of young people, enters the room accompanied by robbers. in front of them, and they see slaves who are also prepared for the auction that will take place today. The girls talk to each other while the main character looks around, and then notices something interesting. This causes him sincere joy. With a sharp look, the guy catches that a weapon is located behind one of the kidnappers, which was taken away during their capture. The hero thinks that he just needs to find an opportunity to pick him up. The auction begins. A man enters the scene, to whom the heroes were delivered when they were captured on the street. He thanks all the guests for their expectations and says that the HID Trading Company event is starting. He also informs that today will be the best auction. The masked stranger asks the rich people who have gathered together for entertainment to stay and not leave until the very end, and then announces that the first product is about to appear. An obese man is brought onto the stage, tears pouring from his eyes. The voices in the hall recognize this man, saying that he is a former baron from the kingdom. The seller announces that his starting price is 1 gold coin. The man who is bidding starts laughing and saying that he expects cheers from the visitors of his event. With his own words, the merchant causes extra contentment, which flows from the hall. Arriving people ask if this is all a joke, say that they do not need such garbage, and demand the next product. The former aristocrat is taken backstage, and the masked man apologizes for such a miscalculation and says that, as an apology, he will immediately show the highlight of his program. 3 heroes appear on the scene: a young man who was caught only because he was threatened with the lives of his girlfriends, and 2 girls who accidentally caught the eye of a robber. They say about the guy that he has no flaws, and his price is 50 gold. The blonde girl has clean skin and shiny hair. Her price is 100 gold. Then she comes to the elf, and they say that her price is 150 gold. The masked man says that it's time to start bidding, and invites the ladies and men who are present here to offer their prices, which rich people begin to do. The elf girl hears the hum of voices and realizes that she may be captured again, against her will, or sold into slavery once again. All this makes tears appear in her eyes, and her body involuntarily shakes with fear. Misha begins to hide behind Clarice, making a barely audible squeak, but all her actions amuse both the seller, who say that the girl was scared by the way the screensavers are made, and one of the men who says that he likes her. An elderly man raises his hand up and, with a sly smile, declares that he is ready to give 10,000 gold coins for all 3 of them. This causes great surprise to the whole audience, because the amount is huge, so no one can surpass it. People start crowding around a man who is willing to spend fabulous money for the company of such bizarre people. But then everyone hears a voice that screams and asks them to stop the bidding. The guests see the doors open, and there appears a man who made an order at the tavern in order for someone to find a girl who got lost in the forest of monsters. He, standing in the company of his guards, declares that this elf belongs to him. A man in an expensive fur coat, veins standing out on his forehead from tension and aggression, and his eyes narrowed, shouts in anger with a crazy expression on his face that Mr. Hyde has taken what belongs to him. The mustachioed hero gives a command to his subordinates and shouts words to them that they must take what belongs to him by right, and the man who owns the auction, in turn, directs a crowd of his robbers to attack and asks them to stop him. 2 such different gangs are directly opposite each other. Cunning and aggression are clearly visible in their eyes. They stand in fighting positions, their weapons are already ready, and the leaders shout the names of their opponents, after which the battle begins. A young man and 2 girls traveling with him are watching the battle. With his eyes wide open, he realizes that such a mess is a great chance to escape. 2 groups of rivals throw at each other. They stand up in pairs and start fighting with swords, axes, anything they can master. So far, no one is winning this battle, as the forces of the opponents are almost equal. The main character, eyes wide open, watches all these actions that are happening in the hall, where tables were previously placed exactly at which rich people who came to the auction sat. Young people look at all this, still standing on the stage with their hands tied, and think that such a large-scale battle broke out very suddenly. They see a mustachioed man and a masked man starting to verbally attack each other. People who had previously participated in the auction offered their price for the trio of young people, ask what is going on here, and start running away so that they get the blows. The main character realizes that no one notices them anymore. The young man uses magic to untie the ropes that held his hands behind his back and realizes that they had a chance to escape, but then one of the robbers enters, who says that they need to take the young man and the girls. After a few seconds, the man turns around and sees that the main character has already freed himself from his shackles. Due to the fact that the man fell into a stupor, the hero manages to attack him, knocking him unconscious, knocking the weapon out of his hands. The main character bends down to take the ball, but then the weapon begins to double in his eyes. Mars closes his eyes and tries to survive an attack of severe pain. Such actions frighten Clarice, and she asks what is going on and if everything is okay with the guy. The young man pretends that everything is fine, gets up carefully and says that everything is fine, asking the girls to follow him. They agree with this. Their actions are noticed by the auction owner and shouts that they are trying to escape. The masked man, who is still standing on the stage behind the podium, looks at the fighting people and asks someone to come to his aid and detain them, but all his warriors are busy fighting. One of the bald men, who brought Mars and his friends to these auctions, fights with a man in a headdress, then says that he has not had such a fun battle for a long time. His opponent realizes that he is already at the limit. The hairless stranger strikes with a sword for the last time and, as if laughing, says goodbye. The second bald man says he's finished and gets rid of the opponent with one blow. The men who are on the side of the stranger, who is the master of the bidding, say that the battle was too easy, and the rivals were big and weak, and they could not resist the magic of sleep. A man with a mustache and an expensive coat notices that all his warriors are unconscious. This surprises him greatly, and then his face becomes very angry, after which he calls them useless people. A stranger asks for a favor from a bully in a raincoat. He asks if everything will be all right, if his rivals will never be able to fight again. His employer answers this question positively and hands him a huge bag of money. After the warrior removes the hood, the scars that dot his face completely become visible. He says that he won't touch those who run away from him, but if someone stays, they should start praying. The people who stayed after the battle think that the giant is strong enough. Just the sight of him makes the old man with a bandage on his face horrified. An elderly man in a state of shock at the sight of his opponent begins to shout a command, during which his men must complete the formation. Bald men obey him and come forward, getting into fighting poses and preparing cold steel. A huge man immediately guesses the tactics of the enemy. He realizes that the two in the vanguard are blocking the enemy's movement. The magician is preparing a spell, and the last man protects the magician while he is defenseless. The bully sees that two bald men begin to approach him, who look similar enough to each other to mistake them for brothers, whose movements are very coordinated with each other. The guy, whose face is covered with scars, throws a money bag in his hands, which was given to him by the customer, thinks that such a tactic would work if he were a monster. After that, he throws a money bag directly at the magician casting the spell. The next second, a huge man quickly approaches two hairless rivals who are still trying to attack him. He asks where they are looking. One of the bald men tells his teammate to cover him while he attacks his opponent. His colleague agrees with this tactic and begins to fly at the enemy, whose eyes become insane. The capillaries in them burst. The bandit who took over the distraction cannot cope with his opponent's huge sword, because he pushes him away so much that he crashes into his colleague. Then they fly off the battlefield together. An old man with a bandage on his face opens his mouth in surprise, because a huge man defeated the whole group in an instant, without letting himself be touched with the tip of his sword. He starts shaking and doesn't know how to win. The giant starts running at the gray-haired man, which only scares him, which is why he recoils and tries to leave the battlefield with a scream and tears in his eyes. A huge man knocks his opponent into the ground with one blow. His actions are monitored by the main character, who took on the battle with other robbers, as well as his client and the commander of the opposite side. A small crater remains in the hall where the tables were previously set up and the auction was going on after a ferocious ball strike. The giant realizes that Jado's quest is over. The warriors run away from him, shouting that he is a monster. A man with a sword on the edge turns to the stage and notices a young man with a sword there. He thinks that only this guy is left, that he is also his rival. There is interest in his eyes. In one leap, a huge man overcomes the distance from the battlefield to the stage and lands right in front of the young man, who stood in a fighting pose. He wonders if he wants the same thing to happen to him that he did to his opponents earlier. The giant says he won't do anything to the main character if he gets out of his way. The guy starts to say that there was a misunderstanding, but the man interrupts him and says that his words were not a request. He does not like to offend children. Becoming more ferocious by the second, the warrior with long black hair asks the young man to leave. The young man's gaze begins to change. His pupils transform. The main character sees a strange image that shows him as if a transparent hand is waving right in front of his face. He doesn't understand what it is. He thinks it's a simple illusion. Then, suddenly, the man, whose face is covered with scars, actually moves his hand to give the young man, who is still holding the sword but not directing it, a slap in the face. Both the main character and his opponent were very surprised by how masterfully, deftly, and quickly the young man dodged a blow from which an ordinary person would have already been unconscious. The next second, the guy noticed the illusion again. After a couple more moments, Mars saw the man moving again, although he was actually standing still. At that moment he realized that he was seeing the future. A huge, long-haired man, who had previously defeated all the bandits alone, really strikes at the young man, but he, thanks to his new gift, deftly leaves the line of fire. The warrior, with great surprise in his eyes, presses his fists to himself and thinks how the young man could have dodged his attack twice already. The man realizes that this cannot be an ordinary accident. Standing in a fighting position and holding a huge black sword in his hands, which helped him eliminate more than one person, the rival of the main character asks him about who he is. The guy, after listening carefully to his words, says that he will tell him his secret if he calmly lets them go, to which the giant refuses. Such a conversation irritates Mars. The young man applies the heavenly eye to the opponent and sees his characteristics. He is surprised, because these are the highest characteristics he has ever seen. The bully, in turn, says that he will not let the young man go just like that. The man wraps the sword with a cloth, because he is worried about the well-being of his young rival, planning only to scare him, and then begins to strike at the young man. The young man notices that his opponent is very fast. Each subsequent blow delivered by a huge sword does not hit the main character, because he manages to dodge. This causes surprise mixed with irritation in Kurt. The man continues to strike, swinging his giant-edged weapon, saying that this time Mars will definitely not evade his ferocious blows. The young man finally decides to lunge and attack his opponent using the sword he had previously tried to defeat the snake in the monster forest, because he waited for the moment when the latter would duck a little. The young man fails to maneuver, and the giant man responds with a blow with his sword, but the guy still continues to hold his weapon in his hands, noticing that Kurt's sword is very heavy. The attack from the big, black-haired man, whose face is covered with scars, continues, but the main character steadfastly withstands the blows and can even repel some of them. The opponent is surprised at how amazing his talent is. The man stops his attacks and stands in front of the young man. He doesn't understand why such a talented youngster helps a slave trader. Kurt says out loud that the main character is missing a huge talent. The young man is trying to catch his breath after such a hard battle. He does not understand what to do. He thinks that it is possible to escape from a man. Then the guy asks his opponent why he does not use his power for the benefit of the people. The main character's thoughts become panicked. He does not understand how he can save Laris and Misha. He keeps yelling at the scarred man and saying that he cheated and kidnapped the poor elf girl. Suddenly, the opponents notice that something is happening on the stage. The auction owner begins to slowly approach the two girls who are traveling with the young man, holding out their hands to them. The young man and Kurt simultaneously launch an attack in order to prevent the girls from being abducted from the stage. The guy uses a water blade spell, and the dark-haired warrior helps him with his huge sword. The simultaneous use of both magic and weapons turns out to be so effective that it tears the scene into two parts. Both people who took part in this look pleased with their work. Suddenly, the mercenary turns to the young man and says that he was very mistaken, informs him that he is not his enemy. He starts talking about his real client. Kurt informs that the one who actually hired him is Misha's mother, whose name is Sasha. A statuesque elf with a weapon at the ready, walking with a confident step, is just approaching the house where the auction was held. After the heroes found out that they are not enemies to each other, but a huge man takes off his ballcloth and asks what the young man's name is, and what kind of technique he used, because it does not look like fencing. All this is being watched from afar by a man who gave Kurt money to deal with his enemies. He doesn't understand why the rivals suddenly became friends. The slaver who came here for his loot, a little embarrassed, asks if his warrior could bring him an elven child. During these conversations, he does not notice that an arrow is pointed at him. In the next second, arrows fly into the man and into the right and left half of his chest. This causes him great, overwhelming pain. A man in an expensive coat falls to his knees as if knocked down, and then, leaning forward, hits his forehead on the floor. After that, the same arrows that were used to attack earlier fly at his feet. All this causes great pain to the slaver who tricked the little elf into kidnapping her. He screams with tears in his eyes. This sound makes the person who organized the auction look around. The head of the trading house, distracted by the sounds of what is happening, turns around and notices that a bow with arrows is pointed at him. The next moment, magic arrows also pierce his shoulders. The main character and the man with whom they are no longer enemies are also looking in the direction from where the arrows are flying. Suddenly, one of them is heading towards the young man. Mars, having hesitated a little, would not have had time to deviate from the path along which the weapon flies, but Kurt covers him, who, turning around, informs him that his customer is already here. The man looks at the elf, who attentively watches what is happening in the building where the trade in magical creatures took place. Then he shouts to her that the person she shot last is not her enemy. Kurt suddenly turns around and starts walking away. He tells Mars to go to Lister National School immediately. Such a statement causes surprise on the young man's face. The man turns up on the second floor in 2 jumps and then disappears into the doorway, but finally shouts that the strongest people in the world are going to the school he advised. He asks the guy to use his name as a recommendation. With a panicked expression in his eyes, the man turns around and asks if the young man remembered everything correctly. At the last moment, Sasha says thanks to Kurt and then jumps down. The woman walks slowly towards the main character with a confident step and with anger in her eyes. 2 girls appear behind the young man who came down from the stage. The elf calls her mother. It helps to change her anger to the joy of meeting her daughter. Tears begin to flow down Sasha's face. She removes the mask from her nose and shouts her daughter's name. Her child runs towards her very quickly, also having a joyful expression on his face. A woman and a girl run towards each other, and the next second they collide in a joyful embrace. They can't believe they're finally reunited. Misha, feeling tears in her mother's eyes, says that she is sad. Sasha admits this, but says that now that she is reunited with her daughter, everything is fine again. The woman continues to squeeze Misha in her arms because she is shaking and says that all this happened because of her. Mom turns the girl around and tells her that now everything will be fine with them and she will never leave her again. A couple of the main characters are watching all this. They are happy that the family reunion has finally happened because they were very worried about their new friend. Suddenly, the young man begins to sway from side to side. His eyes go out and his head begins to tilt back. He uses a huge amount of energy to fight and falls right into Clarice's arms. The girl informs the young man that he did an excellent job and did a good job. The young man, still in her arms, agrees that everything went well and also thanks his girlfriend. Misha, who is sitting in her mother's arms, points at a couple of heroes and says that they helped her. After a while, everyone starts talking about what really happened. After all the problems were resolved, Mars and his faithful companion decided to invite them to the hotel where Sasha is staying now. She asks if the young people are hungry and carries them a tray on which the dish is covered with a huge dome. There is a huge fried chicken under the dome, which is surrounded by all kinds of vegetables and mushrooms. The girl's mother, who recently ran away from a monster in the forest, asks her daughter's rescuers to eat enough. All the characters start eating, rejoicing that this day is finally over, and you can relax, eat, and relax. Sasha is closely watching her daughter, whom she has already missed in such a short period of time, during which they parted. While the characters were enjoying their meal, Sasha told them that the city they found themselves in, called Ganal, had recently literally become a hotbed of crime. The young man, hearing such words, finally understands why Count Beetle told them to avoid this place. The elf, sitting opposite, reports that it is too dangerous for children in the city. The woman holds out a heavy bag, tightly stuffed with money, and says that this is her gratitude for everything that a couple of travelers have done for her and her family. Sasha says that, of course, she understands that the amount in the bag is not enough for them to return her daughter, but they complain that she also spent a lot of money looking for Misha. An adult elf with enthusiasm in her eyes begins to shout that she is truly grateful to them from the bottom of her heart, because they saved the most precious thing she has, so they ask her to thank them properly. The main character reports that such a bag of money is enough for her heartfelt thanks to thank them. The guy also says that they are very glad that they met Misha. A young man and his faithful companion stand in front of a small family and begin to say goodbye to them, saying that they will miss the elf and her daughter. Clarice also promises that they will definitely see each other someday. Sasha and Misha, in turn, look at the travelers with gratitude on their faces and also say goodbye to them. The carriage begins to drive down the street, moving further and further away from the family, who shouts another thank you after them. The carriage soon disappears over the horizon. The girl and the young man continue their journey, leaving one city surrounded by a fortress, after a while approaching another. A couple of travelers enter a wooden two-story hotel located on one of the streets of the city and ask the owner if he has 2 spare rooms in his house. But, after a second, Clarice, without thinking about what she is doing, grabs Mars by the sleeve and wants to start a conversation. The companion of the main character, a little embarrassed but still talking, asks him if they can spend the night in the same room today. The girl confidently looks at her friend and informs him that the beds in the rooms are separate anyway, so this should not cause them embarrassment. The guy is very surprised after such an offer. Sometime later, the heroes who went on a journey are already sitting in the room they rented. They're sitting on different beds, but they still feel awkward sitting next to each other. The main character decides to diffuse the atmosphere and tells his girlfriend to go to the bathroom first. But the girl, on the contrary, declares that she has been taking a bath for quite a long time, so it's better for Mars to go first. The young man begins to argue with Clarice, saying that he's a gentleman, so he must let the lady go ahead. His girlfriend reports that she finds people who call themselves gentlemen very suspicious. The conversation causes the couple to have a fit of laughter, after which the atmosphere of awkwardness that prevailed between them after they found themselves in the same room slowly dissipates. Clarice, sitting in the bathroom, realizes that, after all, she and Mars ended up in the same room. She looks up and, with embarrassment on her face, thinks that nothing will happen because their beds are, after all, different. The girl suddenly jumps up and begins to justify her offer by saying that she would be scared if she were kidnapped again. She believes that it is safer together than alone, and also that it is much more economical to rent one room. After a few minutes, the girl finally sinks into a hot tub where she can relax. After all her thoughts, she concludes that she wants to get a little closer to the main character. He, waiting for his girlfriend in the room, examines the stone. The young man sees that his crystal begins to shine, which causes him great surprise. He jumps up and abruptly sits up on the bed because he understands that if the stone glows, then his family is somewhere nearby. The young man shouts through the closed door that leads to the bathroom that he will leave for a while because it looks like his family is somewhere nearby. Clarice gets up in the bathroom, where she had been lost in her thoughts, and asks her friend to stop and wait for her. The guy, not listening to the words of his good friend, runs out of the hotel. Once on the street, he starts running in an unknown direction, thinking that one of the family members has come to pick him up, and wondering who it could be. The main character sees his father and brother in front of him, in whose hands the crystal also glows, and on their faces there is an expression of deep surprise. The man and the boy, who were previously called by the young man, begin to run in his direction, and he, in turn, hurries to meet them. A second later, the family finds themselves in each other's tight embrace. Sitting at a table in a tavern, Clarice introduces herself to her friend's family, giving her first and last name, saying that she is pleased to finally meet them. The father of the main character says that he is Zeke Bryant, and also reports that he read about the traveler in his son's letters. The boy who is sitting next to him at this time says that he is Mars's brother, Ike. The heroes sat comfortably at the table, and after a while the food they ordered was brought to them. The food turned out to be kebabs. Zeke invited everyone to the table and said that they could have a great conversation over food. A young man and his girlfriend are sitting with both cheeks eating the food that the father of the first ordered for them. The man, in turn, enjoys a drink from a wooden mug. After the company started eating, they began to talk about what obstacles the travelers encountered on their way. They talked about the battle with the infernal snake in the forest of demons, about Misha and Sasha, and about the auction. Zeke's face shows both an excited and surprised expression at the same time. He doesn't understand how the heroes were able to overcome so many challenges alone. Then he says that his son is doing well, and he is proud of him. After the heroes have eaten a hearty meal, they get into the carriage that belonged to the young man's family. His father looks around and asks if they took everything with them, if they left anything at the tavern. Mars, his brother, and the girl who accompanied him during his adventures sit on the floor of the cart and report that they have everything with them. An adult man pulls the reins and informs them that they are going home. The cart slowly passes through the gate that leads to the exit from the city. The heroes cross fields, bridges, then begin to approach the castle, which is surrounded by ominous darkness. The family and Clarice had been on the road for a long time, during which they coped with the monsters they encountered along the way. This was done by a girl who owns a bow. After she destroyed the monster, everyone praised her. Also, during the halts, the young sorceress helped the horse, which quickly got tired of such a fast pace and a long journey. After she used magic, the animal got better, and they continued to move on. The wagon was traveling across the plain when the walls of the fortress, inside which the city is located, appeared in front of them. The heroes drove inside the wall, and then continued their way through the streets of the settlement. After the group of travelers reached their destination, the cart stopped, and an adult man reported that they were finally in the place where they wanted to be. The girl and the boy got out of the carriage. They stopped in front of a huge two-story house. The guy informed them that they had come to see him and told Clarice not to be embarrassed by being here. A couple of travelers noticed a woman on the porch, whose face expressed joyful surprise, and there were tears of happiness in her eyes, and a little girl who stood behind her with the same emotions. Mars and his companion were still standing, not coming close to the house, but the next moment the guy broke off and ran towards the woman who greeted them on the threshold. She, in turn, quickly walked towards him, shouting his name. The woman hugs the young man tightly, and he, in turn, buries his face in her chest. She says, with embarrassment on her cheeks, that she is very glad to see him back. The main character, still in the embrace, says that he is finally home, and also apologizes for making her worry. A little girl is clinging to him from behind, hugging his legs. The little girl says that she is very happy that her brother is back. He confirms that he is at home, and also says that his little sister has grown up a lot during the time that he has been away. The woman finally lets go of her son, then claps her hands and, addressing the girl who has been watching the family all this time, asks if she is Clarice, then introduces herself. They say that she is Mars's mother, Maria. The young sorceress bends down, sitting down a little, pretending to curtsy, after which she says that she is pleased to meet you and then tells you her name. The hero's mother repeats her movement and informs her that the girl has excellent manners. In the late afternoon, the whole family gathers at the dinner table, after which the men of the family and the little girl raise their glasses, congratulating Mars on returning home, telling Clarice that they are very glad to see her. The main character and his faithful companion, who had to leave her own family for the sake of traveling, are sitting at the head of the table. They also raise their mugs and, with embarrassment on their cheeks, cordially thank the family for such a warm welcome. After the family meal ends, but the characters are still sitting at the table, the head of the family takes the floor and asks his wife to help Clarice get comfortable at home. The woman, of course, agrees, after which the girl thanks her for such a service. Maria, with a smile on her face, informs that, perhaps, the young sorceress will be very unusual at first, and therefore not easy to get used to, but then everything will be fine. The girl claims that everything is fine, and it does not bother her. Suddenly, his sister approaches the girlfriend of the main character and says that she is very glad to meet him. The girl rests her folded hands on a bench where a couple of travelers are sitting, puts her head on them, and hears the words that her joy is mutual. Later, it becomes clear that Lena liked Clarice very much. They walk together, take a bath with great fun, and, after all the entertainment, they go to bed together. The young man's brother, Ike, was very absorbed in his studies, so he hardly interacted with the guest. The young man, in turn, helped his father with his work. A whole month has passed for such a daily routine. The main character received a task from Count Carmel. He asked him to clear the Almeria maze of monsters. The young man, along with his companion, as well as his older brother, are happy to undertake such a mission. Arriving in Almeria, a group of travelers stands in line to register for the entrance to the maze. Suddenly, the heroes are hailed by a man whose height is twice as tall as the travelers. He asks where the young man got such equipment from, because he is too young for such a good weapon. He asks if he stole it. The guy is very angry that he is accused of such a heinous act as theft, so he says with anger in his eyes that he and his companion got their equipment from the chests in the maze. The man looks at the guy with disbelief, then points his thumb at himself and offers the young man to prove his ability to wield such a good weapon. The crowd that surrounded the heroes disperses, creating a small circle, inside which the main character and the man who challenged him to a fight turn out to be. The latter informs that if the young man is not good enough, he will take away his equipment. The battle begins very abruptly, but also ends abruptly, because the young man makes a lunge, simultaneously striking his sword in the face of the man who is standing in line with them. After that, the latter loses consciousness. A man is lying on a stone tile that lines the floor of the hall. His arms are outstretched. He is unconscious. His companions begin to approach the hero from behind, and then the question spreads from the crowd. What is going on here? People disperse, letting a handsome man pass ahead. He says with unearthly calmness that he is glad to meet Mars and his brother, because they have not seen each other for a long time. After that, he asks how his father is doing. The eldest son of the Bryant family politely greets the elderly man and informs him that their father asked them to clean up the monsters in the maze. After such a statement, people begin to whisper and ask each other if this child is definitely a member of the Count's family. They also say that they are not surprised that he so easily defeated a man. At this time, the guy holds out a document from his father. A longtime acquaintance of the Bryant family tells the heroes who agreed to help in clearing the maze that he is very grateful for their actions. The travelers politely agree to his gratitude. Eventually, a group of adventurers find themselves in front of a huge entrance to the maze. After they get inside, the guys see big silver birds that fly under the ceiling, and then they start attacking them. The main character's brother informs that these silver birds are D-rank monsters, so he asks his brother and his girlfriend to get ready. The company gets into a fighting position without relaxing its vigilance. A massacre begins to ensue. Ike uses his spear to forcefully pierce birds with it. Mars uses magic to destroy monsters, and Clarice uses a bow and arrow. After the battle is over, the heroes get up and try to catch their breath. But then they see that a magnificent mountain of magic stones appears in front of them. They are thinking about how to take these stones, complaining that it is impossible to take them all. The company amicably decides to return home after such a difficult ordeal, and the older brother of the main character offers to talk to their dad about what to do with so much loot. Upon returning home, the heroes share the events in the maze, to which the head of the family replies that the problem is that there are too many magic stones, so it is impossible to take them all, and the next second says that they are going to buy a slave. Such a sharp offer from Count Bryant causes surprise on the face of all three travelers who recently returned to the mission. A company of young people, led by the head of the Bryant house, comes to an institution where you can buy a slave. The seller asks if they are looking for someone who has high dexterity and strength to use as a porter, and then offers them a slave. After the seller hears the words that the father of the main character is not against his proposal, he asks them to follow him. People amicably pass through a huge hall that stretches over 3 floors. On each floor there are a lot of animal people. The guys start to look around because they have never seen such a sight before. The slaves standing in front of their rooms are leaning over the fences of the floors and carefully watching the delegation of 4 people who came to them. The father of the young people notices that everyone who looks at them looks quite wary. The seller reports that the fact is that the beastmen do not recognize anyone as their masters, so their faces do not show approval. The company approaches a huge door with 2 horizontal cutouts on it. An adult man notices that all the rooms are of different sizes. The main character slowly approaches the door and tries to look through a small crack. Looking carefully inside the room, Mars notices that a blond man is sitting on the carpet in a rather relaxed position, leaning on a lion with a small bow attached to his ear. The personable man turns out to be one of the 12 dukes of the former alliance, Duke Sarantz. He is a representative of the beastmen. The seller says that the man was expelled as a result of a coup d'etat, after which Count Carmel sold him at an exorbitant price. He had acquired it, of course, but the Duke had said that he would not obey someone weaker than him. The young man continues to look at the Duke sitting in a relaxed pose. Then he decides to apply his heavenly eye ability to it to see all its possibilities. The representative of the beastmen notices that he is being watched very closely. He does not really like it, so he quickly approaches the door with a furious look and swings at the main character, which causes his surprise. The Duke has a very strong punch, so he easily breaks the door of the room in which he is imprisoned. Because of this, the young man flies back, along with the fragments left from the door. The guy realizes that he needs to protect the people dear to him, so while he is flying, he uses his magic to push his family, girlfriend, and merchant away from the angry man. While the main character continues his flight, the Duke begins to leave the room. His posture is very tense, and his movements are constrained. In parallel with the events taking place, the young man manages to apply his clairvoyance ability. After the magic is applied, the young man realizes that soon the opponent's hand will be in front of his face. He realizes that physically he no longer has time to deviate, so he groups up, but then hears his girlfriend putting up a barrier. A representative of the beastmen, exiled from the kingdom, begins using his power with his bare fists to break down the barrier that the girl is trying her best to hold back. The young man realizes that if he is hit now, his companion will be in trouble. The young man begins to use his magic, because the barrier is eventually destroyed. His spell is like a bolt of lightning, which, rushing through the fist up the arm, spreads through the body of his opponent. Such strong witchcraft, applied by a young enough boy, surprises both the seller and his family, and the other slaves watching the whole massacre. But the Duke, who is under the influence of magic, is most impressed. The guy looks at his hands with incomprehension. He has never used such magic before, but he thinks it's lightning magic. At the same time, the Duke examines his hand, which has traces similar to a burn, and the hand itself is shaking very much. The young man tries to catch his breath, because he spent a lot of magic, and did it suddenly, even for himself. Then he asks why the man attacked him so suddenly. The representative of the beastmen looks closely at his opponent, and replies that he tried to scan his skills, so he decided to scare him, after which the young man looks very puzzled. The main character, clenching his fists, again hears the words that he tried to study the slave without asking, after which he becomes ashamed of such interference, so he apologizes, leaning at an ideal angle of 90 degrees. Still in a state of bowing, the young man introduces himself, giving his first and last name. The Duke turns around and starts to go back to his room, but the guy stops him with a request to find out his name, if he doesn't mind. The man says his name is Leo Burns. After a short acquaintance, the young man asks once again if he objects to using the assessment. The Duke replies that he doesn't care. The guy's companions look very surprised by such a calm conversation. The Duke stops in front of the main character, as if he kindly allows him to check. The young man is simply amazed at how high his strength, and flexibility skills are. The representative of the beastmen then asks if the main character has finished using the ability reading spell, with a face that does not express any emotions. Mars informs the Duke, with whom he recently fought a battle, that they are looking for a slave, after which he patiently waits for an answer to his remark. The man looks back at the young man and, with anger in his eyes, says that he does not obey someone who is weaker than him, and also he will not go anywhere without his faithful pet. Sarence reports that after such a beautiful fight, the guy, as a possible host, might have been interested in someone else, after which the noise of voices is heard from all sides. The rest of the slaves, who watched all the events taking place, standing on their floors, say that the guy is very good, and also report that he is just fire and ask him to become their master, causes a smile on the young man's face. The main character raises his head up and loudly asks the audience who are slaves. If he can look at them all, they, of course, agree with him. The merchant is watching the whole picture, thinking that Mars is really cool. The father of the main character, and concurrently the head of the Bryant family, asks the guys if everything is okay with him, if they are hurt. A group of friends replies that they are fine, they did not get a single blow. The guests of the establishment for the sale of beastmen choose from the total number of slaves only 5 that they like. In front of them are 3 brothers of the Black Wolf, Mac, Guy, and the youngest of them is Oru. Along with the men, 2 girls were chosen. One of them is Ray, and the other is Misa, who bows modestly and says that she is pleased to meet. The second girl says that she is also glad to serve these gentlemen. The father of the 2 brothers stands in front of the slaves chosen to work in the house, as well as to take out all the jewels from the maze, and tells them to go with them. The company appears next to a magnificent 3-story house that was rented by Zeke Bryant in order to house the people they acquired for their ministry. A door opens in front of a huge company, after which they enter a room that is a dining room. The Count suggests eating first, and then discussing work and the distribution of responsibilities. Everyone sits down at a huge table full of various phenomena. A slave with short black tails on her head asks if her new masters mind that the servants eat with them at the same table. A voice next to her asks why she thinks they shouldn't eat with people together. The girl abruptly gets up from her seat and, pointing her finger at one of the Beastman brothers, reproachfully informs Tom that he must learn to treat with more respect. From such a sudden verbal attack, the young man looks taken aback and sharply agrees with the words of his colleague. The head of the Bryant house looks at all this and says with a smile on his face that everything is fine because there is nothing terrible in the behavior of their new servants. A man turns to his eldest son, asking him to deal with the issue of slave education, but tomorrow. The guy enthusiastically agrees with the task assigned to him. After the heroes and the beastmen have finished eating, The father of the protagonist informs them that it is time for them to begin discussing the duties for which the slaves were acquired. The man, to begin with, talks about the most important rule of their house, which warns that slaves should not attack their masters under any circumstances. Zeke later reveals that they will move in 3 years. The head of the house informs that after the event he mentioned earlier happens, he will take 3 male beastmen with him to the dungeons, while the girls will serve in the estate. After dinner, the characters began to be distributed around the house, which was rented for a while by Count Bryant. Then they went to their rooms, having previously decided who would sleep with whom in the room. After night falls, the lights are still on in the 3-story house, and the words of the protagonist's father are heard from inside that all preparations will begin tomorrow. The 3 Beastmen brothers went to the Adventurers Guild, where they confirmed their qualifications as E-rank adventurers. When they went outside, they immediately began to brag about their titles. The dark-haired guys approach Ike and enthusiastically ask their master what they should do next. The young man replies that he will give them tasks after he sees their abilities in action. The eldest son of the Bryant's family takes the slaves to the maze where they were earlier. After they were inside, the young man told them to defeat the monsters. The creatures that the slaves bought in the trading house had to fight were stone lizards, whose characteristics are quite high, but the servants of the House of Bryants are not amiss. The brothers, without hesitation, rush into battle, abruptly taking off from their place, moving away from their masters. The emotions of the young men are very different, starting with the expressionless face of Mac, ending with the cheerful face of Guy. Everyone involuntarily chooses one creature to fight with, because the number of monsters with shells is also 3. Everyone assumes a fighting position. One of the guys runs up to his monster, stands in front of him, firmly stepping with his feet on the ground, raises his hand to strike, and then sharply hits the lizard's muzzle. While the young man, whose being lies unconscious, rejoices, saying that one missed blow is not a verdict, his brother is just starting the battle, raising his leg to strike. The middle brother, jumping up, puts his limb forward, after which he strikes right between the lizard's eyes, which causes his shoe and part of his pant leg to come off and fly away. Oru, who is the youngest of the beastmen, wraps his arms around his creature's neck and begins to squeeze it. After such an extraordinary series of actions, the monster loses consciousness. When the battle with the stone lizards has been completed, the brothers begin to hobble towards the main character, his brother, and the girlfriend who travels with him. Oru is holding onto his back, which was touched by the monster, and Mac is standing in one shoe. Later, the beastmen line up and report that they have defeated everyone. There is satisfaction on their faces, because they got off with only minor injuries, while they are very satisfied with their work. The 3 adventurers with the rank of E stand in front of their masters. They ask if it's true that they did a good job. They are interested in whether they will be praised for their work. The elder brother of the main character smiles, holding his weapon in his hands, but at the same time says that such a fight is no good. He complains that they did not cope with such an easy task. Such a statement causes indignation among the beastmen, because they believe that they did a great job. So the eldest of the brothers asks for what reason the master believes that they failed. The guy turns to his younger brother and his companion and informs them that before answering the slaves' questions, they need to be treated, which is what a couple of travelers should do. The girl approaches the brothers and, starting with the eldest, uses her healing magic on them, healing the damage sustained during the brutal battle with the stone lizards. Oru, the youngest of the group of relatives, says that the little lady is quite interesting because she can use sacred magic, and also reports that he has heard that people who own her grow up quickly, and then he is interested in her age. A couple from Clarice and Mars turn to the brothers and tell them in unison that they are 8 years old. With such information, they cause more surprise on the faces of the slaves. The eldest of the brothers asks the girlfriend of the main character if she has such an adult physique because she uses sacred magic. The other brothers rush at Guy, grabbing him in their arms and starting to beat him, telling him how this can be regarded. The younger and middle beastmen bow low and say that they humbly apologize to Clarice, then force the elder to apologize, to which the girl replies that everything is fine. After clearing his throat, Ike informs them that now that the slaves are in full health, he is ready to talk to them about the mistakes they made during the battle. The young man steps forward, leaving his family and the beastmen behind, gets into a fighting position, holding his spear on his head, and then asks everyone to carefully watch his actions. The guy makes a deceptive maneuver and does not use a weapon, but releases a flame from his hand, calling the command fire. This kind of magic has a blinding effect on monsters, which is why they get lost in space. The flames continue to cover the stone lizards. Then, after a few seconds, a young man's spear digs into the neck of one of them, sharply piercing it through. After the first creature has been finished, the young man rushes at the second, cutting off his head with his weapon. He then turns to the slaves and asks if they understood what they had done wrong. The eldest of the brothers, smiling, waves his hand in front of his face and, with an awkward laugh, informs them that they do not know how to use sacred magic. With these words, he exasperates the first son of the House of Bryants because it turned out that he did not understand the essence that the owner wanted to convey to them, so he screams that the main thing in their business is not magic, but the right combat strategy. The young man remembers how the three brothers fought their battle, noticing the shortcomings of each, and also saying that they put too much force, so when they enter the maze they will not be able to advance for a long time because they will quickly get injured. Young people carefully listen to the advice and instructions of their young master, who ends his speech with, which means that the distribution of responsibilities is correct. The brothers should fight together. The guy calls the grizzly bear to them and informs them that he wants to make sure that the slaves understood his words correctly and will do everything without injury. The bear has great strength and endurance. He raises his huge paw to strike, but his attack is knocked down by his older brother. While the animal is distracted, an oru is directed at it and takes a firm grip, thereby immobilizing it. The last step to the victory of the three beastmen is the middle brother, who jumps high, bends his leg in flight, and strikes it right on the head of the grizzly. This finishes off their opponent. The relatives stand and look at the result of the work they have done, after which they turn to their young master and ask how the fight is for him, and whether they have coped with their task. The guy raises his hand in front of him and gives a thumbs up, thereby assessing their abilities. The beastmen are glad to be praised. The company goes further down the corridor, and then the voice of one of them is heard, who says that they must first go up to the second floor and fight monsters there, and then go home. As soon as the guys with their slaves are on the floor above, everyone freezes in shock, opening their mouths because they are faced with a terrible sight. None of the adventurers understand what is going on there. The youngest son of the Bryant family reports that he did not expect so many insects on the second floor of the maze. Then he notices that there are a lot of ants there and says that it is necessary to warn the guild that there is danger. Two brothers come to the head of the Adventurers Guild and tell them that they have urgent news. He responds, breaking away from the conversation, and asks what is so urgent. The man introduces his interlocutor, calling him Margrave Evan Sorum. The mustachioed old man says he's glad to meet Mars and Ike. After such a short conversation, an acquaintance of the Count's family leans forward and impatiently asks the unexpected guests to move on to the news. The young man says that in the maze on the second floor, they found a huge number of insect monsters. The head of the guild jumps up from his seat and asks if they are killer ants. This question surprises the two young adventurers. The man continues to broadcast that the monsters he is talking about devour everything around, and thanks to this, they multiply rapidly. They should live in the forest of death, but for some reason they ended up in a maze. The old man complains that if the number of ants continues to grow, the maze will no longer be able to feed them. After that, the man lowers his eyes and realizes that he does not know how to cope with this problem. Several minutes pass in awkward silence. The brothers, the head of the guild, and the old man who had previously talked with an acquaintance of Count Bryant's are silent. Suddenly, the latter looks up and asks Mars and his older brother what they would do if they were in his place. This makes the boys think, but then the younger one raises his head and starts saying that he has come up with a way out of the situation. The main character reports that he would have called 3 groups from the ranks of Arguzia, Brown Shield, Blue Fangs, and Red Wings. After that, the guy continues, he would then convince to join such an improvised army of beastmen slaves. In the end, he would have called the best adventurers in the city, and it would have turned out to be a small army to fight monsters. The young man, sitting surrounded by his brother and 2 adult men, continues to tell his plan, saying that all his past proposals are not yet the final version, because the most important thing remains. Confidently looking ahead, the main character informs that the presence of Mr. Burns, whom he saw in the house where slaves are sold, is absolutely necessary in this detachment. The words of the young man inspire faith in adult men, which is why they jump up from their seats to the words of the boy, that you cannot give up, you need to fight with all your might to the end. After Ralph heard about the beastman's strength, which defied anyone weaker than him, he agreed to such a plan. He ordered to contact Count Bryant quickly. The next day, in the early morning, an army is assembled, consisting of all the people previously named by the guy. The father and mother of the main character are standing in front of them, saying that they should start. A detachment of Brown Shield, Blue Fang, and Red Wings also gathered in one room. Mars and his faithful companion are watching all this, and the guy's brother is also with them. Their dad asks what the beastmen decided. Evan Sawarum reports that almost all the slaves who are beastmen have agreed to help destroy monsters that look like giant ants. But the Count complains that he couldn't even talk to Burns. The man turns to the main character and, looking into his eyes, says that the guy sitting in the room with the lion told him to come visit himself and try to convince him to participate in their plan. After a while, the young man is already standing in front of the open door of the cell where Burns is located. He stands in the doorway and, looking down from high, says that he thought he would never see him again.